They threw her into the canyon like she was nothing. Bramwell Rusk didn't even watch her fall. He turned his horse around before her body hit the first ledge, straightened his coat, and told his men to ride back to town. Just like that. A woman's life disposed of in under a minute. Because she had the nerve to show up in Copper Hollow holding a deed to land he wanted. Because she was poor. Because she was heavy. Because he decided she didn't count. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the canyon would give her something back. Something that had been buried down there for years. Something that was going to cost Bramwell Rusk everything he'd spent his whole life stealing. She didn't die in that canyon. She came out of it with the truth. And the truth was worse than any gun. If this is your first time here, welcome. And if you've been with us before, you already know we don't do ordinary stories on this channel. We bring you the ones that stay with you. The ones where ordinary people face impossible odds and refuse to break. If that's what you're looking for, hit subscribe right now, so you never miss what comes next. Tap the like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment telling us the city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to Copper Hollow, Arizona Territory, 1887. And let's start with the worst morning of Lenora Whitcombe's life. The stagecoach dropped her at the edge of town with a single trunk, a canvas satchel, and the particular silence of a driver who decided she wasn't worth conversation. Lenora stepped down without help, caught her balance on the rutted road, and stood there a moment looking at Copper Hollow like it owed her something, because technically it did. Her father had written to her about this place, called it rough but honest, said the beside Deadman's maw wasn't much to look at, but it was hers when he was gone, and she should come claim it. He died 6 weeks later from a fever that moved fast and didn't negotiate, and Lenora had packed everything she owned into that one trunk and spent the last of her cash on a stage ticket from Santa Fe. She was 26 years old. She weighed more than the town expected a woman traveling alone to weigh. She had her father's deed folded in thirds inside her coat pocket, next to a small knife she didn't entirely know how to use. She needed water, food, and directions to the land registry office, in that order. What she got instead was Bramwell Rusk. She hadn't even made it to the hotel when she heard him. He was standing outside the feed store with 2 men she didn't know, dressed in the kind of clothes that announced money before the man opened his mouth. Hat with a silver band, custom boots, the unhurried posture of someone who hadn't been told no in a very long time. He looked at her the way certain men look at women they've already decided don't matter. Stage from Santa Fe, was it, he said. Not quite to her, not quite to his companions. Volume calibrated for an audience. Lenora kept walking. That trunk looks heavy. A pause, then again. The 2 men laughed. Not loud, just enough. She stopped. She knew she shouldn't, knew the smart move was to keep walking and let them have their little moment. But she stopped anyway. Because something about the particular quality of that laugh, comfortable, unhurried, used to being unchallenged, made her jaw tighten in a way she recognized. Something you want to say to me directly? She asked. Rusk turned to look at her fully. He had a broad red face and the kind of eyes that were always slightly amused, slightly bored. The face of a man performing confidence. For so long it had calcified into his features. Just making an observation, he said pleasantly. Copper Hollow doesn't get many visitors. Especially not. He glanced at her trunk, unaccompanied ones. I'm not a visitor, she said. I own land here. Something shifted behind his eyes. Almost invisible. Is that right? That's right, my father was Elias Whitcombe. He left me a claim beside Deadman's maw. I'm here to register it. The pleasant expression didn't change. But the quality of it changed. The way water changes quality right before it goes cold. Whitcombe, he repeated slowly. Elias Whitcombe's daughter. His only daughter, yes. Rusk looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, full and warm and completely hollow, and touched the brim of his hat. Well, welcome to Copper Hollow, Miss Whitcombe. You'll find the registry office on the main street, 3rd building past the livery. Hope your stay is comfortable. He turned away. She kept walking. Neither of them said another word. She didn't know, standing on that road with the dust settling behind the stage and the Arizona sun cutting down at an angle that found every exposed inch of skin, that Bramwell Rusk had already started thinking about how to get rid of her. The registry office smelled like old paper and lamp oil, and the clerk behind the desk had the exhausted look of a man who'd answered the same 3 questions 10,000 times. Lenora gave her name, showed the deed, and explained what she was there to do. The clerk unfolded the document carefully, held it toward the light, checked the seal. He confirmed it was valid. He told her the claim had never been formally contested, which she took as good news until she saw how he said it quickly, without meeting her eyes, moving on before she could ask follow-up questions. She filed the paperwork herself, paid the small registration fee from the very bottom of her coin purse, walked out into the afternoon. She found a room at the only hotel in town that would take her, a narrow place above a laundry called the Territorial Rest, run by a woman named Mrs. Aldgate, who quoted her a rate slightly higher than what was written on the board, then pretended the board said something different when Lenora pointed at it. Lenora paid what was on the board. Mrs. Aldgate wrote her a receipt with the expression of someone eating something sour. She was hungry enough that she didn't care. She ate at the lunch counter next door, beans, bread, coffee, that tasted like someone had been angry when they made it and tried to organize her thoughts. The land was hers on paper. She needed to see it in person. She needed to figure out what it would take to make something of it, because she had almost no money left, and no plan beyond arriving, which she was increasingly aware had not been enough of a plan. She'd told herself the land was the starting point. She just hadn't been prepared for how far from everything else the starting point was going to feel. She went to sleep that night, listening to the wind move through the gaps in the hotel walls, and told herself she was not afraid. She told herself this several times before she actually believed it enough to sleep. She found Rusk's men at her land before she found the land itself. She'd rented a horse from the livery in the morning, another transaction that cost more than it should have. Most of its windows were dark, the liveryman eyeing her in a way that suggested he'd already decided she was temporary and followed the directions the clerk had given her. The claim was southwest of town, past the dry wash and the pile of flat-topped boulders that people apparently called the stack. The land sat at the edge of a wide empty stretch that ended abruptly at Deadman's Maw, a canyon that cut deep and sudden into the earth, its walls dropping almost straight down into shadow. Lenora pulled up short when she saw the 2 men standing near a surveyor's tripod at the edge of what her deed described as her northeastern boundary. They saw her. They didn't move. "Can I help you?" she called. The taller one, lean with a sun-darkened face and a flat effect she didn't like, looked at her with no particular expression. "This is Ruskland." "You're trespassing." "I'm not," she said. "This is my claim. I filed it yesterday at the registry. Filing errors happen." The man said this the way someone recites a sentence they've said before. There wasn't an error. She reached into her coat. "I have the deed right. You can take that up with Mr. Rusk," he said, already turning back to the tripod. She stood there for a moment, with her hand inside her coat. The other man hadn't spoken at all, was looking at her horse, not her face. She turned the horse around and rode back to town. Rusk's office was in the largest building on the main street, which she thought said something about him. She didn't wait for his secretary to announce her. She pushed through the inner door and found him behind a desk that could have seated 6 people, papers arranged in precise stacks, a map of the territory pinned to the wall behind him. He looked up, and to his credit, he looked genuinely surprised. "Miss Whitcombe, your men are on my land." He leaned back. Not guilty, just thoughtful, the way a man looks when presented with an interesting problem. "That's a serious accusation. It's a serious observation. 2 men's surveyor's equipment at the northeast edge of the claim my father left me, and I registered yesterday morning." She put the deed on his desk. "My deed. Valid. Registered, stamped." He looked at it without touching it. "I'm sure there's a misunderstanding somewhere." "Then clear it up. Call your men off." "Lenora." He said her first name like he'd earned the right to it. "Your father's claim, and I knew Elias. We had dealings over the years, was never properly developed. The land beside the Maw is difficult terrain. No water, no shelter, no access. I've had a legitimate survey underway for the past several weeks, because we believed the claim had reverted after Elias's death. It didn't revert. I'm his heir. That's what the deed says. Heirs have to be present to file. I'm present. I filed." He was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled, and it was a different smile than the one on the street, smaller, with more teeth. "I'll have my men stand down while we sort out the paperwork issue." "There isn't a paperwork issue." There might be, he said simply. You'd be surprised how often there is in cases like this. She picked up the deed. She left his office. She walked back through the secretary's room with her chin up and her back straight and didn't let anything show on her face until she was on the street again. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from the particular fury of understanding clearly, for the first time, exactly what was being done to her and exactly how little she could do about it through official channels, because the man controlling the unofficial channels had just told her, very politely, that paperwork issues had a way of appearing. She went back to the hotel. She sat on the edge of the bed. She thought for a long time. She decided she would go look at the land herself, without the men being there, and figure out what she actually had, and whether there was any path forward. If the land was genuinely worthless, she'd know that. If it wasn't, she'd figure out why Rusk wanted it. She went early the next morning before dawn. She almost made it. She was picking her way along the canyon edge, compass in hand, trying to match the terrain to the descriptions in the deed, when she heard the horses behind her. She turned. 3 riders, the lean man from before, and 2 others she didn't recognize. And behind them, pulling up at a comfortable distance, Bramwell Rusk himself, sitting his horse like a man who had no reason to hurry because outcomes had already been arranged. Miss Whitcombe, he called. Early morning for a ride. This is my land, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. It was going to be such a simple thing, Rusk said, and the pleasantness was completely gone now. Just a flat statement, the way a man talks, when he's past the part of a conversation he finds interesting. I offered you a fair price for that deed. You hadn't even read the offer. You didn't offer me anything. My men were going to... He dismounted slowly. But you went to the registry before they could reach you. That was inconvenient. You want to buy my father's land. I want to stop having this conversation. He nodded at the lean man. She understood what was about to happen about 2 seconds before it happened, which was enough time to feel the full shape of it, but not enough time to do anything about it. The lean man came off his horse fast, one hand closing on her arm, the other going for the inside pocket of her coat. She grabbed for his wrist and got a fistful of sleeve and held on. She was stronger than he expected, which bought her maybe 3 seconds, but there were 2 of them. And then the deed was out of her coat and in the lean man's hand. And then Rusk was holding it, and she was still holding on to the lean man's sleeve like it was going to matter. Let go, the lean man said. He wasn't angry, just practical about it. She let go. Rusk folded the deed without looking at it, put it in his own coat. And then he said something she'd think about many times later, in the dark, when she was trying to understand what kind of man could say this. You shouldn't have come here alone. That was genuinely foolish. He said it like a piece of advice, like she'd made a navigational error. Then he nodded at his men. The first shove sent her sideways. She caught her balance on instinct, but the ground near the maw's edge was uneven, loose shale over hard rock, and then there was a second impact, a deliberate push full force from behind, and the edge wasn't where she thought it was. She grabbed at nothing. She went over. She hit the first ledge with her left shoulder and felt something tear in a white-hot explosion that stole her breath entirely. Rolled, hit a second ledge with her hip, bounced against the canyon wall, and scraped down it for what felt like forever, and was probably 3 seconds. Then she was on the floor of Deadman's maw, on her side, one cheek in the dirt, every part of her screaming. She lay still. Above her, maybe 40 feet up, she could just hear the sound of hoofbeats. Leaving. They hadn't even checked. She lay there in the shadow of the canyon and tried to breathe and took inventory. Left shoulder bad. Right hip bad. Both hands torn up from grabbing at the rock face. Head ringing but intact. She touched the side of her skull carefully. Her fingers came back with some blood on them, but not a frightening amount. She was alive. She couldn't tell yet if that was going to mean anything. The canyon floor was narrow here, shadowed by walls that rose on both sides. She was in a crease of land that didn't see direct sun except for maybe 2 hours a day, and those 2 hours weren't now. The air was cooler than above, which meant she wouldn't overheat immediately, which was the single piece of good news she could identify. She got herself to a sitting position. It cost her more than she wanted to admit. She looked up at the canyon rim. Far, too far to climb in her current condition, and the walls she could see were sheer, crumbling shale with nothing to grab. She looked along the canyon floor in both directions. The maw ran east and west as far as she could see, curving slightly to the south, narrowing as it went. She had no water. She had the small knife which had survived in her boot. She had the compass, still in her coat pocket somehow. She had her coat, which was torn in 3 places. She had whatever physical resources her body had left after a 40-foot fall. She thought about her father, about what he'd written. The land isn't much, Lenora, but there's something to it if you know how to look. She'd assumed he meant topsoil, water access, something agricultural.
Exit.
Now, sitting on the floor of the canyon his so-called worthless land bordered, with nothing but time and pain and the quiet drip of desperation, she started wondering if he'd meant something else. She started looking. The soil directly beneath her was pale and dry. She moved east, walking slowly, her hip protesting every step. The soil stayed dry. She moved west. 20 minutes later, or maybe 40, she'd stopped trusting her sense of time. She noticed something. Not dramatic. Not a sudden revelation. Just a small, stubborn fact. The ground beneath a particular section of the canyon wall looked darker. Just slightly. The way ground looks when it hasn't dried all the way out. She crouched down beside it, put her palm flat to the earth, damp. She looked at the wall above it, looked at the base of the wall. There was a shadow there, not the shadow of the wall itself, but a different depth of darkness, a recess, or more than a recess. She put her shoulder against the wall and pushed. Stone moved. Not much. A few inches. Just enough to let a breath of cooler air escape, and with it the faint, unmistakable smell of underground water. Lenora sat back on her heels, looked at what she'd found, understood, in a rough and disbelieving way, that she was looking at an entrance. That her father's supposedly worthless land sat above something that had been hidden deliberately. That the man who'd pushed her into this canyon to die had no idea it was here. She'd come into the maw with nothing. She was about to find out exactly what that meant. The entrance wasn't big enough to walk through standing up. Lenora had to turn sideways and bend at the waist, one arm pressed against the stone to keep her balance, her injured shoulder screaming every time she shifted her weight wrong. The gap in the canyon wall was maybe 2 feet wide and 4 feet tall, narrow enough that someone walking past wouldn't look twice at it, especially in the light the canyon floor got, which was the diffused, half-hearted light of a place the sun visited reluctantly. She got through it. On the other side, she straightened slowly, and the darkness settled around her like something with weight to it. She couldn't see the far wall. She couldn't see much of anything except the pale slice of canyon light behind her and, somewhere ahead, the faint sound she'd noticed before, not quite dripping, not quite flowing, somewhere between the two. She pulled the small knife from her boot, not because she expected anything to attack her, just because holding something solid helped her think. She moved toward the sound. The floor of the passage sloped down at a shallow angle, uneven but navigable. Most of its windows were dark. The air was cooler than the canyon, which told her she was going deeper underground, and it had that particular mineral smell, cold stone and standing water, and something older than either of those things. She kept one hand on the wall as she walked, feeling the rock change texture as she went, from rough shale to something smoother, almost like the stone had been worked. She almost missed the water. She was so focused on keeping her footing that she stepped directly into it before she registered. It was there, a shallow pool, ankle-deep, spreading across the floor of a wider space. She stopped, let her eyes adjust. The chamber wasn't enormous, but it was far larger than she'd expected. Maybe 30 feet across, maybe more. The ceiling was higher here. She could stand fully upright with room above her head. The pool fed from a crack in the far wall, a steady seep that collected in the natural bowl of the stone floor and drained off through a gap she couldn't locate by sound alone. She cupped water in her hands, drank. It was cold and clean, and tasted like the earth it had come through, and she drank 3 handfuls before she made herself stop and breathe. Then she looked around properly. They were stacked against the right wall of the chamber. She saw the shapes before she understood what they were: irregular outlines in the darkness, the wrong shapes for natural stone. Boxes, crates, something that might have been a chest, iron-banded, sitting lower than the rest because it was heavier. She crossed the chamber slowly, water pulling at her boots with every step. She put her hand on the nearest crate. Old wood, dry despite the moisture in the air, which meant it had been up on the stones deliberately, lifted clear of the pool's reach. Whoever had put these things here had thought about it, had planned to leave them for a while. She found the seam of the crate lid and worked at it with the knife. The wood had swelled and contracted through enough seasons that it resisted. She worked at it for what felt like a long time, jaw set, bad shoulder aching with every twist of her wrist, until the lid gave with a crack that sounded enormous in the underground silence. Inside, canvas-wrapped shapes. She pulled the canvas back from the nearest one, looked at what she was holding, a leather-bound ledger. Its cover tooled with a simple pattern and a stamped date, 1881, 6 years ago. She set it aside and checked the rest of the crate. More ledgers. 6 in total, different dates. The earliest from 1878, and beneath them, wrapped separately in oilcloth and tied with cord, a bundle of letters and documents, the edges crisp despite the years. She looked at the iron-banded chest. It was padlocked. She didn't have the key. But the lock was old, and she spent 10 minutes working at the hasp with the knife until the screws pulling it into the wood gave up. And she lifted the lid. Gold. Not a fortune, not the kind of stacked bars you'd see in a treasury illustration, but real gold, raw and worked both, pressed into rough ingots the size of her fist. She counted 12 of them. She picked one up, heavier than it looked. Her arm shook slightly, and she told herself it was the injury. She sat back on a dry section of stone and opened the first ledger. She couldn't read it all. The light was too poor, and her head was still ringing from the fall, and her eyes kept swimming. But she could read enough. Columns of numbers. Names she didn't know beside amounts she did. And one name that appeared over and over, initials at first, BR, then later spelled out in a different hand, as if whoever was writing had stopped caring about discretion. Bramwell Rusk. She closed the ledger, sat with it on her lap, felt the weight of what she was holding, and it had nothing to do with the leather binding. She thought about her father, about his letters, which she'd read so many times she'd worn the folds thin. He'd written about the land beside the canyon, but he'd also written things she hadn't quite understood at the time, careful, circling things, like a man trying to say something important while not being sure whether it was safe to say it directly. There's more to this claim than it looks like. Lenora, don't let anyone talk you out of it. Don't sell it cheap, and don't sign anything you haven't read 3 times. She'd thought he was just being cautious, fatherly, protective of her, in the vague, generalized way of men who worried about their daughters in the world alone. She understood now that he'd been specific. He'd known something was here, maybe not exactly what, but he'd known the land mattered for reasons that had nothing to do with topsoil, and Rusk had known it too, or suspected it, and decided a woman alone and poor and unfamiliar with the territory was the easiest version of this problem to solve. He'd been wrong about that. She put the ledger back in the crate, replaced the canvas carefully, and lowered the lid as best she could. She needed to get out of the canyon. She needed to get out of the canyon badly, because her body was making arguments, having trouble dismissing. The shoulder was stiffening, and the hip was worse than she'd admitted, and her head felt like something loose was bouncing around inside it. But she couldn't carry the evidence out, not in her condition, not climbing any wall she could identify. So she memorized what she could, the location, the number of ledgers, the dates, the name. Then she went back through the passage, back into the canyon, and started trying to figure out how to get herself out of Deadman's maw alive. She walked for a long time before she found the place where the canyon wall had fractured and slumped into something climbable, adult. It wasn't safe. It wasn't close to safe. The loose rock shifted under her boots in ways that made her stomach drop, and she had to stop twice when her shoulder gave out entirely and made her grip useless. The second time, she hung from one arm for a bad few seconds with 40 feet of canyon below her and made herself think about nothing except the next handhold. She got to the top. She rolled onto the flat ground and lay there on her back, staring at the afternoon sky, and breathed. She was not going to cry. She had decided that somewhere around the second ledge she'd bounced off on the way down, and she was committed to it. She got up. She'd lost track of where the horse was likely gone back toward town on its own by now, which was going to cost her a deposit she couldn't afford. She started walking in the direction of the Rusk Ranch, which she knew was somewhere north of the claim, based on something she'd heard the clerk mention. She wasn't going toward the Rusk Ranch. She was going perpendicular to it, toward the low country east of the canyon, toward the scattered ranches she'd seen from the stage road. She walked until her vision started graying at the edges. She sat down, told herself it was just for a minute, and woke up with her face in the dirt and the sun considerably lower than it had been. She got up again, kept walking. She didn't hear the horse until it was close, and by then she didn't have the energy to startle. Harlan Quade almost didn't see her. He'd been riding the east side of the Badlands for 2 hours looking for a calf that had gotten through a gap in the fence he hadn't gotten around to fixing, which he'd been meaning to fix for 3 weeks, which was now going to result in a productive conversation with himself about priorities. He was not in a good mood. He was hot and tired, and the calf was probably fine, probably wandered back to the herd on its own, because animals had more sense than he gave them credit for, but he wasn't able to stop looking until he'd looked. He saw what he thought was a pile of clothing near a rock formation. Then it moved. He pulled up the horse. The woman was sitting against the base of a boulder, her legs stretched out in front of her, her coat torn across both shoulders. She had dried blood on the side of her head and fresh blood on both hands where the skin had been torn off. Her face was the gray-white of someone who had been past their limit for a while. She looked up at him. Her eyes were clear, which surprised him. "I'm not going to pretend I'm fine," she said, "because that would be a waste of both our time." He got down from the horse, crouched a few feet away, which he'd learned was the right distance when approaching someone who was hurt and didn't know him. "What happened?" "I fell into Deadman's maw." A pause. "I was pushed." He looked at the state of her. The injury pattern made sense for a canyon fall: the shoulder, the hip, the way she was holding herself. He'd seen it before, years back, when a ranch hand had gone over a ledge in a storm. "How'd you get out?" Slowly. She met his eyes without any particular plea in them. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was just telling him what was true. "I need to get somewhere I'm not visible from the Rusk Ranch, and I need water." He was quiet for a moment. He had a canteen on the saddle. He got it and handed it to her. She drank, without grabbing at it, without spilling the controlled drinking of someone who knew better than to rush it. She handed it back. "Thank you." "I'm Harlan Quade," he said. "My ranch is about 4 miles east." Lenora Whitcombe. She tried to stand, made it halfway before her hip, made a decision her determination hadn't been consulted about. Harlan put a hand under her arm before he thought about it, caught her weight, and she didn't pull away. 4 miles, she said. "I can manage that on horseback if you could manage being on a horse. I've had worse days." She said this completely straight-faced. Most of its windows were dark. Then something flickered at the corner of her mouth that might have been the beginning of something like dark humor. "Actually, no, I haven't." He got her onto the horse. It took 2 attempts because of the shoulder. She didn't complain once, which he noticed because in his experience people in her condition usually did, and he wouldn't have blamed her if she had. He rode behind her, and they went slow, east across the flat, empty Badlands toward his property line. She passed out about 2 miles in, which she'd expected. He kept one arm around her and adjusted his pace and tried not to jostle her more than necessary on the rough ground. She woke up on a cot in a room that smelled like wood smoke and old coffee, with a wool blanket over her and her coat folded on a chair nearby. So most of its windows were dark. Someone had done something approximate to cleaning the wounds on her hands. They were wrapped in strips of what looked like an old shirt. She lay still for a moment and took inventory of her pain, which was extensive but organized, which she chose to interpret as progress. She could hear someone in another room. Movement, the clink of something metal, the low sound of a man talking to himself in the way of someone who spent a lot of time alone. She sat up. The room was small and plainly furnished: the cot, the chair, a washstand with a cracked mirror, a window that looked out onto a fenced yard, and beyond it, a barn in need of new boards on one side. Nothing decorative. Nothing that looked like anyone had thought recently about comfort. She stood. Her hip protested but held. She went to the door. The front room of the ranch house was larger than the back room, and almost as plain, with a rough table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, and more evidence of a man who lived alone than she could conveniently ignore. Dishes that had been washed but not stored. A jacket on the back of a chair that had been there long enough to leave an impression. On most of its windowsill, a framed photograph of a woman younger than Lenora, dark-haired, posed stiffly the way people posed for formal photographs that had accumulated enough dust that it clearly hadn't been moved in some time, but was also clearly the thing in the room that had been left in place most deliberately. Harlan was at the stove. He turned when he heard her, and his expression went through something relief, she thought, and something cautious behind it. "You shouldn't be up. I've been unconscious for how long? You went out on the ride. It's been about 6 hours. She absorbed this. "I need to tell you something about why I was in that canyon. You can do it sitting down." He pulled out one of the chairs. She sat. Not because she wanted to, but because her body was making compelling arguments. He poured coffee without asking and put it in front of her. And she wrapped both bandaged hands around the cup and looked at the grain of the table and tried to organize her thoughts into the version that was accurate without being everything. She told him about her father, about the deed, about Rusk's men at the boundary, and then Rusk himself, and the thing he'd said, "I want to stop having this conversation," and the way it had happened so fast, the lean man's hands, and then no ground under her feet. Harlan sat down across from her and listened with his hand flat on the table, and his face still. He didn't interrupt. He didn't do the thing some men did, which was to start solving the problem out loud, before she'd finished explaining what the problem was. When she stopped, he was quiet for a moment. "The lean man," he said. "Pale scar runs jaw to ear on the left side," she thought. "Yes, Dace Moreland, Rusk's tracker." His voice was level, but something in it had gone flat, in a way she recognized as controlled feeling. "He was there when Rusk's men cut the fence line between my north pasture and the Whitmore claim last spring. Cost me 6 head of cattle I never recovered." She looked at him. "Rusk took your cattle. Rusk's men cut a fence. The cattle wandered. By the time the law looked into it, there was nothing to connect the fence to anyone." He picked up his coffee, set it down without drinking it. "Sheriff in Copper Hollow and I have had that conversation twice. Both times I walked out with nothing." She thought about the ledgers, the columns of numbers, the names she hadn't recognized. "How long has he been doing this?" she asked. "Far as I can tell, Rusk's been operating this way since before I came here, 7 years ago. He'd already built his empire by then, but he was still expanding it." Harlan looked out the window. The ranchers, who sold sheep and moved on most of them, didn't sell because they wanted to. They sold because things kept going wrong. Bad seasons, stolen stock, legal troubles that appeared from nowhere. He paused. One man, Alderman Clay, he didn't sell. He just disappeared. Left his wife and 3 children on the property. Rusk bought the land at auction for back taxes 6 months later. The silence held between them. "He thinks I'm dead," Lenora said. Harlan looked at her. "Does he?" "He pushed me into a canyon and rode away without checking. He thinks I'm dead or going to be. That buys you something. Not much. When you don't surface, he'll start thinking about the deed, whether he needs to file on the claim formally, whether anyone will ask questions." He was thinking out loud, she realized. Not for her benefit specifically, just thinking the problem through. "How long before someone in town notices you're gone? The hotel knows I'm there. My trunk is still in the room," she calculated. 3 days, maybe 4, before Mrs. Aldgate rents the room to someone else and decides to worry. So we have time. She noted the "we" without commenting on it. "There's something else," she said. "Something I found in the canyon." She told him about the passage, the chamber, the water, the crates, the ledgers, the gold. She told him the names she'd read in the columns. Harlan listened without moving. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she started to wonder if she'd misjudged him, if the willingness to pull a stranger out of the Badlands and put her on a cot didn't necessarily extend to willingness to step into the middle of whatever this was. "You read Rusk's name in those ledgers," he said finally. "Multiple entries. Multiple years. Different handwriting in places, like more than one person's was keeping the records. What kind of transactions?" "I didn't have enough light to read thoroughly. But the numbers were large, and there were names beside them, amounts paid out. I need to go back and get those ledgers." He stood up, went to the window, stood there with his back to her for a moment, looking at the yard, the barn, the fenced expanse of his property that ended somewhere in the middle distance at a boundary she couldn't see. "My wife died 3 years ago," he said. "Not to her exactly. Just putting it in the room. Fever, it went fast. After that, I stopped doing much of anything that wasn't strictly necessary." He turned around. His face was the same still, composed, but something behind it had shifted. I haven't had a reason to pick a fight with Bramwell Rusk, even knowing what I know about him. There didn't seem to be a way to win. She looked at him across the table. There might be now. He looked back at her. You can't go back into that canyon in your condition. No, she agreed, not today. A corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The acknowledgement of someone who appreciated precision. Not today, he repeated. He pulled the other chair out and sat back down. Tell me everything you remember. What you read, what you saw, how the passage was laid out. Everything. We'll figure out how to do this right, she told him. He listened. The coffee went cold between them and neither of them noticed. It took her 5 days. She hadn't planned on 5 days, but her body had its own schedule and it wasn't consulting her. The shoulder needed 2 of those days before she could lift her arm above her waist without losing her ability to think about anything else. The hip was worse. There was no clean break, which Harlan confirmed by examination with the blunt confidence of a man who'd assessed livestock injuries and extrapolated but deep bruising that made walking a sustained negotiation. She spent the time usefully. Harlan had more documentation of Rusk's activities than she'd expected. Notes he'd kept after each encounter with Rusk's men, receipts for cattle that had been listed in the county records as belonging to him, and then quietly changed. A letter from the former rancher Alderman Clay's wife, written after she'd been forced off the Lentin, that named Rusk, directly in language that was vivid and detailed and would mean nothing without corroboration. She read it all. She also, during this time, learned things about Harlan Quade through observation rather than conversation, which was the way you actually learned things about people who didn't volunteer much. He woke before sunrise and worked through the day without stopping except to eat, and he ate functional food that he cooked without ceremony and sometimes didn't finish before going back out to whatever task he'd interrupted. He talked to his horses in a low, continuous murmur that wasn't exactly words. He had books, a surprising number of them, stacked in the back room with the disciplined mess of someone who actually read. He didn't ask her questions she hadn't invited. He gave her space and privacy and functional comfort without making any of it feel like charity. On the 3rd day, she came outside to find him replacing boards on the side of the barn she'd noticed was deteriorating. He didn't acknowledge her arrival, just continued working, and she stood for a moment watching him work before she picked up the other end of the board he was about to lift and held it against the barn wall. He looked at her arm raised above her waist. "Shoulders better," she said. "I can see that." He positioned the board. "Hold it there." They worked for 2 hours without much conversation. It was the kind of comfortable quiet that Lenora hadn't felt in a long time since her father, actually. Since working alongside him in ways that didn't require words, because both people knew what needed doing. She noticed it the same way she noticed the weight of the ledger in the underground chamber, something significant registering as fact before the significance fully arrived. On the 5th day, she said she was ready. He didn't argue. He got the horses. They went before dawn. Not to avoid Rusk specifically. If Moreland was tracking, he'd find their trail eventually, regardless of the hour. They went before dawn because that was when the canyon had the best light on its western approach, which was the direction they needed. And because Lenora was done waiting. Harlan had rope, good rope, coiled and tied to his saddle, because she'd described the climb out and he'd said nothing but procured the rope the following day. He also had a lamp with enough oil for several hours and a grain sack for carrying what they found. The passage was where she'd left it. Of course it was. She'd spent considerable mental energy worrying it would somehow be different, that she'd imagined it or misremembered the location, that the canyon wall would be smooth and solid, and she'd have to reckon with the possibility that the fall had done more damage than she'd accounted for. But it was there, the darker patch of earth, the shadow that was deeper than the wall, the cold breath of underground air. Harlan looked at the entrance without comment, looked at the width of it. He was broader in the shoulders than she was. "I can get through," he said, not as a question, and he was right, though it was a near thing. Inside the chamber, he held the lamp while she went through the crates. In proper light, the ledgers were clearer than she'd hoped, and more detailed than she'd expected. They sat cross-legged on the dry stone section and read together, taking turns holding the lamp, reading aloud sections that meant something. It took 2 hours. By the time they were done, neither of them spoke for a while. Insects. Harlan set the lamp down carefully and put his hands on his knees and looked at the middle distance the way a man looks when he's reorganizing his understanding of something large. It's not just the cattle, he said finally. No, the ledgers documented more than a decade of Rusk's operations. Stolen stock, significant amounts, distributed to various points north and east under different bills of sale, the paper trail carefully fragmented. Land acquisition through legal manipulation, timber rights filed on top of existing claims, water access quietly redirected, tax notices that appeared to have gone missing before they reached their intended recipients. Money paid to names in Copper Hollow that included, without ambiguity, a figure identified only by initials that corresponded in timing and amount to payments that would have gone to a county sheriff. And then the letters. The letters in the oilcloth bundle were different from the ledgers. The ledgers were records cold, operational, the language of someone tracking transactions. The letters were something else. They were written by a man who had been afraid and had written down what he knew because he needed to put it somewhere and had hidden it in a place he apparently believed was secure. The writer's name appeared nowhere in the letters, but the events described were specific. Dates, locations, names, 6 years ago. A gang called the Iron Mesa Riders had been operating through the territory robbery, mostly some violence, nothing that rose to the level of catastrophe, but enough that there was a reward and a territorial marshal involved. The letters described a meeting between the Riders' leadership and Bramwell Rusk, a plan the gang would take down a government gold shipment moving through the territory. Rusk would ensure the route information reached them. In exchange, the reward money disappeared. The gang got pardons and new identities, and Rusk got a percentage of the gold. That was the plan. What actually happened was different. Rusk had gone to the sheriff and the town doctor, both of whom were already in his pocket, and 2 other men whose names appeared fully written in the letters. They'd set up an ambush, not of the gold shipment, of the Iron Mesa Riders themselves, at the meeting point where the gang had gathered to receive their route information and finalize the plan. The Riders had walked into it. 5 men dead. 1 survived long enough to talk, which was how the letter writer knew the details. He'd been the survivor's physician, apparently, or close enough to one. The survivor had lasted 3 days before he, too, died. The sheriff's office had reported the Rusk killed in a gunfight while attempting to rob a federal courier. Rusk and his associates had collected the reward money. The government gold shipment had been rerouted, and its actual fate was unclear from the letters alone, though the ledger entries from that period included a line item that matched no legitimate income. The gold in this chest, Lenora said slowly. Harlan picked up one of the ingots, turned it over. On the flat face, stamped into the metal, were letters and numbers she hadn't been able to read in the poor light of her first visit. He held it toward the lamp. U.S. government property. An assay mark. A date. Harlan set the ingot down. He hid the evidence in the same place he hid the gold, Lenora said. Or someone else hid it here. Someone who knew about the chamber and thought it was safe storage. Harlan picked up the letters again, looked at the handwriting. The man who wrote these, he knew what Rusk did. He kept records. He hid them somewhere Rusk presumably didn't know about. My father's land. The passage opens from inside the canyon. From above, this chamber is invisible. The only way to find it is from the canyon floor. He looked at her. Your father found it. Somehow. And Rusk figured out that Elias Whitcombe had found something, even if he didn't know what. She thought about her father's careful, circling letters. Don't sell it cheap. Don't sign anything you haven't read 3 times. He hadn't told her about the chamber directly. Maybe he hadn't been sure what he'd found. Maybe he'd been afraid to write it in a letter. Maybe he'd intended to tell her in person and run out of time. He wanted me to come, she said. He knew Rusk was going to try to take the land. He left me the deed because he wanted someone to find this. It was a guess. She knew it was a guess, but it had the particular feeling of a guess that was also true. Harlan was quiet for a moment. We can't take this to the sheriff. No, we can't take it to anyone in Copper Hollow. The letter names the doctor. The ledger implicates the county office. He was listing it out, not for her benefit, she'd already thought it through, but for his own, the way you verbalized a plan to check if it held together. We need to go over their heads. The territorial capital. There's a federal marshal's office. She'd looked it up during her 5 days at the ranch in a worn almanac she'd found on Harlan's shelf. 2 days' ride. Maybe 3 if we go careful. If we take Moreland off the board first. She looked at him. He's Rusk's eyes, Harlan said. If we disappear with saddlebags full of paper and a confiscated prisoner, Rusk will know within a day. He'll send men after us, and he knows this territory better than we do. He was very calm when he said this, in the way of a man who'd worked through several steps before speaking. We need to get the evidence out without Rusk knowing what we're taking or where we're taking it. She looked at the crates, the ledgers, the letters in their oilcloth bundle, the chest with its 12 gold ingots, each stamped with marks that were as good as a signed confession. We take what we can carry, she said. The letters and the 2 most important ledgers. The ingots are evidence on their own, but we can't carry 12 of them without a pack horse, and a pack horse makes us slower and more visible. 2 ingots, he said, to confirm the gold exists and connect it to the government shipment. 2 ingots. She started loading the grain sack. Her shoulder ached and her hip was stiff from the damp air in the chamber. We go back to your ranch today. We rest 1 night. We ride at first light tomorrow. He was already refolding the oilcloth around the letters. There's one more problem. Moreland. He'll be watching the approaches to this canyon. Rusks will have had him out here since you went over the edge, making sure no one goes in looking for a body that isn't there. She tied off the grain sack, picked up the lamp, looked at Harlan in the low amber light of the underground chamber, in the middle of everything hidden, with the sound of the seeping water behind them and the weight of what they'd found in her hands. Then we'll have to be smarter than him, she said. Outside the sun was higher than she'd expected. Time moved differently underground. She stood at the passage entrance and looked along the canyon floor in both directions, and listened to the silence and thought about what Harlan had said about Moreland. She'd heard water while they were in the chamber, the usual seep, the usual drip. But there'd been something else toward the end, a sound she hadn't consciously registered until now. Distant, rolling, the particular quality of sound that traveled underground before it arrived above. She looked up at the sky. To the southwest, the clouds that hadn't been there at dawn were now stacked dark and flat-bottomed and moving fast. Harlan, she said. He was already looking. Flash flood weather, he said. The canyon floor around them was dry. It wouldn't stay that way. They moved. They moved fast, but not fast enough. The canyon floor was still dry when they started climbing, which was the deceptive thing about flash flood country. The danger came from miles away, from water that fell on ground you couldn't see and funneled towards you through channels you didn't know existed. By the time you heard it, you had less time than you thought. By the time you felt it, you had almost none. Harlan went up the rope first, which Lenora didn't argue about because she needed him at the top to anchor it for her climb, and because her shoulder was already protesting the grain sack she had strapped across her back. He moved fast and efficient up the canyon wall, finding holds she couldn't quite make out from below, and when he reached the rim, he braced and threw the rope's loose ends back down without being asked. She grabbed it with both hands and started up. Her shoulder held for the first 15 feet. It was the next 10 that became a negotiation between what she needed her body to do and what it was willing to agree to. The grain sack shifted with every move, pulling her off balance, and twice her boot slipped on the shale face, and she hung for a moment on her arms alone. The bad shoulder screaming in a register that thought entirely and went straight to the part of the brain that only knew one word. She kept climbing. Harlan's hand closed around her wrist when she reached the top, and he pulled, and then she was over the rim and on flat ground with the grain sack intact and her shoulder feeling like something had been pulled loose and reattached slightly wrong. She stood up without help. She was allowed to accept a hand over a canyon rim. She was not going to be carried. "You're white," Harlan said. "I'm aware." She adjusted the grain sack strap with her good arm. "How far to the horses?" "Quarter mile." He was already looking at the sky. The flat-bottomed clouds organized themselves into the southwest, some things more source and serious while they were underground. The kind of formation that didn't negotiate. "We need to move." They moved. The horses were where they'd left them, tied to a stand of scrub, mesquite a cautious distance from the canyon rim. The animals were already agitated, ears back, weight shifting, reading the weather in ways humans couldn't. Lenora got the grain sack tied to her saddle, with hands that were not entirely steady, and told herself it was the exertion. They were half a mile from the canyon when she's heard it. It wasn't a roar. That was the thing about it. It didn't sound like what it was. It sounded like sustained pressure, like a sound that had been there for a while, and she'd only just tuned into the right frequency to hear it. A low moving wall of sound that had nothing to do with wind. Go, Harlan said. They rode. Behind them, Deadman's maw swallowed the water from a storm that had broken 40 miles to the southwest, on ground that's straight toward the canyon system. It was not a gentle process. Later, much later, when Lenora tried to describe what she'd heard from half a mile away, she would say it sounded like the earth changing its mind about something. They made it to higher ground and stopped the horses and looked back. The canyon was invisible below the rim, but the sound was visible in its way, a vibration in the air that you felt behind your sternum before you heard it properly. The scrub mesquite they'd tied the horses to was 60 yards from the rim, and already water was running past at the base of it, shallow and fast, finding its channels. Lenora sat her horse and looked at the place where she'd gone over the edge, where Bramwell Rusk had turned his back and ridden away. Moorland, she said. Harlan had been scanning the flat country around them. I haven't seen sign of him. He'll be watching approaches. Not standing in the open. She looked along the rim line, east and west. He's here somewhere. He just hasn't shown himself yet. Maybe he thinks there's nothing to watch. If Rusk believes you're dead, Rusk is thorough. He wouldn't leave the canyon unobserved. Not with my hotel room, still holding my trunk. She was thinking out loud, fitting the pieces together in the way that had become her primary occupation since waking up on Harlan's cot. He needs to know no one goes looking. Moorland's here. Harlan said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, it was carefully the way he said things when they mattered. If Moorland saw us come out of that canyon with a grain sack, Rusk knows by tonight. Yes. And if Rusk knows what's in that grain sack, he'll come for it before we can get to the territorial capital. She looked at the grain sack tied to her saddle, the 2 ledgers, the oilcloth bundle, the 2 gold ingots wrapped in cloth at the bottom, heavy and specific and damning. We don't go back to your ranch. He looked at her. If Moorland followed us, she said, he knows where your ranch is. That's the first place Rusk will send men. She looked north, then east. Is there another way to the Capitol Road? One that doesn't pass through Copper Hollow and doesn't go near your property. There's a stage route that cuts northeast through the valley. Takes longer to reach it full day's ride through rough country, but it joins the main road 60 miles from the capital. Does Moorland know that route? He knows every route in this territory. That's what trackers do. She considered this. The sky overhead had gone the particular pale yellow of a storm that had exhausted itself elsewhere and was now just moving air. The immediate danger of the flood was past. The other kind of danger was entirely present. Then we don't take the straightest road, she said. We take the one where we can see behind us. They rode northeast. It was rough country. Harlan had been accurate about that. The kind of terrain that was hard on horses and harder on riders, broken arroyos and loose rock and stretches where the ground looked solid until you were on it, and discovered it wasn't. They kept off the ridgeline and moved through the low country where they could, which slowed them and was the point. For the first 2 hours, Lenora watched their back trail with the systematic attention of someone who had recently updated her understanding of what people were capable of. She saw Moorland an hour before he showed himself, a dark shape on a rise to the southwest, moving parallel rather than closing, which was interesting because a tracker who wanted to take something from you closed on you, and one who was waiting for something held his distance and watched. Moorland was watching. He's not coming for us, she told Harlan. Harlan glanced back without stopping. He's reporting, which means Rusk is behind him somewhere. Or Moorland is going to report back, and Rusk will intercept on the road ahead. She thought about this. The grain sack felt heavier than its contents justified. He's counting on us to take the Capitol Road. He'll set up on the road. He knows every route, Harlan said again. He wasn't disagreeing with her, just flagging the constraint. Every known route, she said. How often do people ride straight across the Alderman Flats? He looked at her. Almost never. The ground's unreliable. There are sections that look passable and aren't. But you know them. A long pause. I know them. Then we go across. He looked at the sky. The light was going in the particular fast way of desert afternoons, the color shifting from yellow-white to orange in the span of minutes. We'd be crossing in the dark, some of it. Yes. That's not, I know, she said. Can you do it? He was quiet for a moment. She'd noticed this about him, the way he went quiet before committing to something, not hesitation, but a kind of internal consultation, checking the real answer before giving it. I can do it, he said. Then Moreland can follow us into the flats, or he can ride ahead to the road. Either way, we'll know which choice he makes, and we'll plan accordingly. She looked back once more. The shape on the rise had stopped. She could feel the specific quality of distance observation, the way it created a pressure between the observer and the observed, that was almost physical. Then Moreland turned his horse and rode southwest, toward Copper Hollow. He's going to Rusk, Harlan said. He is. She pressed her heels to the horse's sides. Let's not waste what that buys us. The Alderman Flats at night were the kind of dark that reminded you how much your eyes normally relied on secondary light-reflected sky, distant fires, the ambient glow of human habitation. Out here there was none of that. The stars were extraordinary and completely impractical for navigation on ground that shifted without warning. Harlan led. She followed his horse's outline and watched the ground and didn't say anything when he stopped to check their bearing, which she did by feel and memory, and something she didn't entirely understand, but chose to trust because she's had to trust something. They went through a section of alkali flat where the crust held under the horse's weight, but made a sound with every step like someone cracking thin ice, deliberate and final. And she kept expecting it to give, and it didn't. They crossed an arroyo that was dry but had walls 8 feet high, and the going down was manageable, but the going up required both horses to scramble and her grain sack to shift violently, and her shoulder to voice an opinion. She didn't say anything. She kept riding. At some point in the deepest part of the night, Harlan stopped and said they could rest the horses for an hour. They didn't make a fire. They sat on the ground with their backs against a rock that still held the heat of the day, and they drank from canteens, and Harlan produced a cloth wrapped around hard cheese and dried meat that was not good by any culinary measure, and which she ate completely. Tell me about your father, he said. She looked at the stars for a moment. Why? Because I've been riding beside a woman whose father left her a claim to a canyon with a hidden chamber full of evidence that could bring down the most powerful man in the territory, and I'd like to understand how that happens. She almost smiled. Elias Whitcombe was not a complicated man. He was a surveyor, mostly. Worked for landowners, worked for the county, worked for whoever needed land measured and documented. Traveled a lot. She paused. He was honest. Genuinely, stubbornly honest. It didn't always work out well for him financially. How did he find the chamber? I've been thinking about that. He was a surveyor. He would have been in that canyon for legitimate work at some point, measuring the boundary of his own claim, maybe, or someone else's near it. He would have noticed the moisture pattern. He would have gone looking. She looked at the grain sack. Most of its windows were dark, and then he would have realized what he found and known that he couldn't do anything with it directly. Not in Copper Hollow, not where Rusk owned the sheriff and probably the county office. So he waited. He got sick before he could do more than wait. She said this without sentiment, not because she didn't have it, but because she'd already lived through that period. And the way through grief was usually to let it be a fact instead of a wound you kept reopening. He left me the deed because the deed was the key to the land, and the land was the key to the chamber. He knew I'd come. He knew I wouldn't sell cheap. She paused. He underestimated how fast Rusk would move. Rusk was waiting for him to die. Probably. And then I showed up before he could file on the claim, and he panicked. Or something close to it. She looked east, where the horizon was beginning to make a distinction between itself and the sky above it. He made a mistake. Pushing me into that canyon was a mistake. He should have paid me off, or scared me off, or buried the paperwork so slowly I couldn't prove anything. Instead, he put me in the one place where the evidence was. Harlan was quiet. For a moment. Do you think he knew what was in the chamber? I don't know. The letters were written by someone who was frightened. Someone who had information and nowhere safe to put it. That person knew the chamber existed. They used it for storage, she thought. But the ledgers feel different. The ledgers are Rusk's operational records, or copies of them. How did they end up down there? Unless Rusk put them there himself. She looked at him. Think about it, Harlan said slowly. A man who operates the way Rusk does, he needs records for himself, for keeping track. But he can't keep them anywhere that could be searched. If he found the chamber independently, or learned about it from someone, he hid his own records there. She sat with this. It had a logic to it that was unpleasant and elegant at the same time. And so then someone else, the letter writer, whoever was frightened enough to write all that down, found out about the chamber and added their own documents. Or was the original user and Rusk discovered it from them? Either way, Rusk doesn't know the letters are there. Or he does, and the letter writer is someone he's already dealt with. The darkness between them held that thought for a moment. We need to read those letters more carefully, she said, when we have light. They rode again when the horizon went from gray to pink. The flats gave way to harder ground by mid-morning, and by noon they'd picked up the stage route and turned northeast on a road that felt almost luxurious after the previous night. She read the letters as they rode, one hand on the reins and the oilcloth bundle balanced on her saddle. The author's identity had been something she'd partially bracketed anonymous, frightened, a witness with a physician's knowledge. But reading more carefully now, with full daylight, and the particular attention of someone who'd spent 5 days thinking about Rusk's network, she began to see things she'd missed in the chamber's lamplight. The letter writer had referred to specific medical details that weren't just clinical knowledge the way he described the survivor's injuries. The care taken in those descriptions suggested someone who had actually treated the man, not observed from a distance, present. Which narrowed it. The letter writer had been in the room where the Iron Mesa rider had died over 3 days, and had been trusted enough to be left alone with him. The town doctor, Copper Hollow's physician, whose initials appeared in the ledger as a payment recipient. Someone that's been part of Rusk's network, and then apparently had been frightened enough by what he'd witnessed to document it and hide the documentation. The doctor, she said. Harlan looked at her, the letter writer. It's the Copper Hollow physician. He was there when the survivor of the Iron Mesa ambush died. He treated him. The man told him what happened to all of it. The deal with Rusk, the ambush, the gold. She held up the last page of the letters, where the handwriting was different from the earlier pages, more erratic, pressed hard into the paper. He wrote this because he knew what Rusk had done, and he was afraid he was next. And then he hid it in the only place Rusk didn't control. But Rusk's ledgers are in the same place. Which means either the doctor knew Rusk used the chamber and chose it anyway, trusting that Rusk wouldn't look carefully at what was already there, or the doctor put his letters there first, and Rusk found the chamber later through the doctor himself. She folded the letters back into their oilcloth. The doctor is still in Copper Hollow, still working, which means Rusk decided he was more useful alive and obedient than dead and problematic. Or the doctor buried what he knew deep enough that Rusk doesn't see him as a threat. Either way, he knows everything. She looked at the road ahead. When the federal marshal comes, the doctor is the first person who can corroborate the letters. If he's still willing to talk. That's a significant if. It is, she agreed. But frightened men sometimes find their courage when they see the walls moving. They were 20 miles down the stage route when Harlan said, "Someone's behind us." She didn't look immediately. She had learned this from him, the discipline of not looking until you'd decided how you wanted to handle what you saw. She finished folding the oilcloth and tucked it into the grain sack. Then she looked. 2 riders. A mile back, not pushing their pace, keeping the same distance they'd been keeping since she'd first registered them as something other than background. Moreland, she said. One of them. The other one I don't know from this distance. How far to the next town on this route? 16 miles. Place called Ridgeback. Has a marshal's substation, or used to. Used to? Last time I came through was 2 years ago. The marshal station there moved on. Don't know if they've replaced him. She thought about 16 miles and 2 riders maintaining a deliberate following distance and what that distance meant in terms of intention. They weren't closing. They weren't trying to catch us up. They were being seen on purpose. They want us to know they're there, she said. They want us to make a decision based on seeing them. Run or stop or turn back. She looked at the horizon ahead. Rusk thinks we'll make a mistake if we're rattled enough. He doesn't know us well enough yet. What do we do? She thought about the grain sack, the ledgers and the letters and the 2 gold ingots, all of it sitting in saddlebag canvas on a stage route with 16 miles to the nearest town and 2 of Rusk's men behind them, and the certainty that the road ahead had been considered by those men before they'd taken position. We hold our pace, she said. We don't run and we don't stop. If they close on us, we'll deal with it. But I don't think they're going to close. Why not? Because Moreland had us in the canyon, and he didn't take the shot. He went back to Rusk. That means Rusk gave him specific instructions about what to do and what not to do, and one of those instructions was not to create a body on a public road that someone might find inconvenient. She said this with more certainty than she entirely had, because the alternative was to allow the fear to make decisions, and she'd seen where that led. The canyon wall. Rusk's pleasant face, they held their pace. The two riders held theirs, 16 miles of that, measured in the rhythm of hoofbeats and the angle of the sun, and the particular tension of two people trying not to show the other how carefully they were managing their own fear. Ridgeback was 8 buildings and a water tank and a stage depot that doubled as a general store and a room in the back that had a desk with a federal marshal's territorial seal on a document tacked above it, and behind the desk, a man in his 50s with a deputy marshal's badge who looked up when they walked in with the weary alertness of someone who'd been watching for trouble in a quiet place long enough to half-stop believing it would actually arrive. His name was Carver. He had a rangy build and a careful, thorough way of listening that immediately distinguished him from the Copper Hollow sheriff in Lenora's mind, where every comparison had become automatic. She put the grain sack on his desk. She told him, precisely and without elaboration, what it contained and where it had come from and what they needed. He looked at her. He looked at Harlan. He opened the grain sack. He spent 40 minutes with the ledgers and letters while they waited outside, not because he asked them to, but because the room was small and she needed air that didn't have walls around it. Through the window, she could see the stage route south. The two riders had not come into town. They'd stopped at the edge and were visible on a rise about 3/4 of a mile back. Making themselves seen, she went back inside. "These documents are genuine," Carver said. He hadn't phrased it as a question, but he looked at her when he said it. "Yes." "And the gold ingots are stamped government property." "Yes." He set the ledger down with the particular care of someone who understood what they were holding. "The man named in these letters Rusk, he's currently operating in Copper Hollow. He's currently the most powerful man in Copper Hollow, which is why we're standing in front of you instead of the county sheriff, Shep." Carver looked at Harlan. "You're the rancher who lost cattle." "Among others," Harlan said. "Rusk has been doing this for years. There are other ranchers who can corroborate what's in those ledgers if they're given a safe way to do it. The witnesses to the Iron Mesa ambush all dead, as far as we know, except the letter writer, who is almost certainly still alive and still in Copper Hollow, and who will either confirm everything in those letters or will need to be protected before he disappears." She looked at Carver steadily. "There are 2 of Rusk's men on a rise outside your town right now. They've been following us from the canyon. They didn't come in because they want us to know they're there without creating an incident on your doorstep. Rusk is being very careful." Carver looked out the window. "I see them. How quickly can you get word to the territorial marshal?" He turned back to her. "Fastest rider could make it in a day and a half. Can you spare a rider?" Something moved across his face. He was assessing her in the way that men assessed women in positions of authority that hadn't been formally granted, looking for the thing underneath the confidence, trying to decide if the substance matched the manner. She held his gaze and didn't explain herself further, because the documents were the explanation. "I can spare a rider," he said. "Then we need to send word today, right now. And we need to find a secure place to hold these documents until the marshal arrives." She looked at the grain sack. "Rusk's men outside will report back that we came here. He'll move fast once he knows we've reached a law office he doesn't own." "How do you know he doesn't own this one?" She looked at him. "I don't. I'm making a judgment." He absorbed this. He looked at the badge on his own chest for a moment. A brief look, and she couldn't quite read it, whether it was self-assurance or reminder or something else. Then he stood up. "I'll get the rider." She didn't sleep that night. Not really. Carver gave them the back room with a cot and a chair, and Harlan took the cot without argument because she hadn't slept in 2 days and he'd had 1 night on the flats. She sat in the chair with the grain sack on her lap and the knife from her boot in her hand and listened to the building settle and the nights outside do what nights did. She thought about her father, about the letters in the oilcloth, and the frightened doctor who had written them in whatever room he'd had access to after 3 days at the bedside of a dying man. About what it cost a person to write the truth down and hide it when they were too afraid to say it out loud. Whether that cost was bravery or cowardice or the complicated territory between them where most actual human decisions got made. She thought about Rusk, about his face when she'd put her father's deed on his desk, not afraid, not guilty. Just that flat, thoughtful look, the way a man looks at a problem that hasn't been arranged to his two specifications yet. She understood now that she hadn't been a threat to him that day. She'd been an inconvenience, a minor logistical issue. She wondered when exactly she'd stopped being an inconvenience and become something else. She thought it was probably the moment she'd climbed out of Deadman's maw on her own. Harlan's breathing was even an anachronism. She listened to it and found it steadying in a way she didn't analyze too carefully. At some point before dawn, she heard horses. She was at the window before she'd consciously decided to stand, the knife in her hand, her heart moving fast. She looked through the glass. Carver was in the yard. Two of the horses from the stable. He was saddling them in the dark, with the practiced efficiencies of a man who had done it often and did not need light to find the cinch. She went to the door. "Someone's coming," Carver said, not turning around. From the southwest. More than 2 riders. She stood in the doorway. In the distance far, but closing, she could pick out what he'd heard. Multiple hoofbeats. Moving at purpose. She went back to the room and put her hand on Harlan's shoulder. He woke immediately in the way of people who slept expecting to. She told him in 3 words. He was upright and dressed, and at the door in under a minute. Carver had the horses ready. He'd also done something she hadn't expected. He'd retrieved the grain sack from where she'd stored it under the cot, and he was holding it out to her. "You take this," he said. "I'm going to stay. Someone needs to be here when they arrive to keep them from burning the building. You can't stop them alone. I'm not stopping anyone. I'm being a federal deputy who received some travelers and has no idea what they were carrying." He was calm about it in the precise way of someone who'd thought through the math and arrived at an answer for they didn't love but had committed to. Rusk doesn't want a dead federal man on his record. It's the one thing that brings attention he can't manage. He'll be aggressive, but he won't cross that line. You're gambling on that, yes. He held out the grain sack. Go. Northeast. Stay off the main road for the first 10 miles, and don't stop until you're far enough that you can find a telegraph office. My rider is already gone. The marshal's office will receive word by tomorrow evening. But the documents need to exist when the marshal arrives. She took the grain sack. She looked at him for a moment, this tired, careful man in his 50s with his badge and his borrowed cot and his willingness to stand in the way of something larger than himself, armed with nothing more than the logic that federal authority had. Limit someone like Rusk's, still nominally respected. "Thank you," she said. He made a dismissive motion with one hand. "Go." They went. The riders from the southwest were close enough that she could hear them individually. The texture of the sound had changed, multiple horses resolving from a general rumble into distinct rhythms. She and Harlan cleared the depot yard and turned northeast and pushed the horses to a pace that wasn't sustainable but was necessary. Behind her, she heard the sound of new arrivals entering Ridgeback. She didn't look back. She focused on the road ahead, on the grain sack tied to her saddle, on Harlan's horse 2 lengths ahead of her, on the particular arithmetic of distance and speed, and what it would take to get to a telegraph office before Rusk's men figured out which direction they'd gone. And then ahead, still distant, still manageable, she heard a third sound. Not horses this time, lower, coming from a direction she hadn't expected. She looked at Harlan. He'd heard it too. He pulled up briefly, and they both listened. Most of its windows were dark. The sound was coming from the northwest, from the direction of the Alderman Flats they'd crossed the night before, and it had the specific quality of a large group of horses moving at organized speed, not the improvised pursuit of men sent hastily, but the coordinated movement of riders who'd been positioned and were now converging. Rusk had anticipated them turning northeast. He'd sent men around. Lenora looked at the distance between their position and the northwest riders. A mile, maybe slightly more, closing. She looked at the grain sack. She looked at Harlan. "We're not going to outrun them," he said. He said it without catastrophe, just the plain fact. "No," she agreed. She thought very fast, the road ahead. The terrain to either side scrub and broken rock, the kind of ground that was bad for horses and worse for riders moving at speed. The distance to the riders from the southwest, who would clear Ridgeback in minutes if Carver couldn't hold them. She looked at Harlan. "Do you trust me?" A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. Yes. Then listen. Here's what we're going to do. She told him. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize, not doubt, exactly, but the weighing of something, the internal consultation. That might work, he said. It might. If Moreland gets there first, it won't. Then we need to move now. She looked at him. Harlan. I know. He shortened his reins, looked at the northwest horizon where the riders were coming. I know. They split. She went one way and he went another, and the sound of her horse's hooves on the hard earth was the loneliest sound she'd heard since the canyon floor. But she didn't let herself think about that, because the plan required her to be somewhere specific in the next 4 minutes. And that was the only thing she had room for right now. The Northwest riders saw her and adjusted course. She kept riding. The grain sack bounced at her saddle. Her shoulder was a sustained complaint, and the terrain ahead was rough in ways she was only discovering as she covered it. But she kept the horse at pace and watched the distance close between herself and the low outcropping of red rock she'd spotted from the road. And she thought about her father's deed in Rusk's coat pocket, and she thought about Carver standing in a depot yard with a badge between himself and something large, and she thought about 12 gold ingots in an underground chamber and what they'd paid for. And she kept riding. The outcropping came up fast. She pulled the horse to a stop behind it, got down in a single motion, led the horse into the shadow of the rock, and waited. 20 seconds. She heard Moreland before she saw him. His horse was moving at a pace that said he'd seen her stop and had read it wrong, thought she'd given up, was coming in with the confidence of someone who believed the problem had resolved. He came around the south face of the outcropping at a near gallop and pulled up hard when he found her standing in his path, not running, not hiding, standing with the grain sack in her hands and her feet planted and her bad shoulder back and to the side in a way that was either poor posture or someone positioning their stronger arm. Moreland got his horse under control. He looked at her. He looked at the grain sack. He looked around for Harlan and didn't find him. Put it down, he said. Where's Rusk? She said. I want to speak to Rusk. This surprised him. She'd counted on it surprising him, because Moreland was a man who worked from a menu of expected behaviors, and hers wasn't on it. That's not how this works. It is today. She kept her eyes on his face. Not his hands, his face, because the hands would tell her what had already been decided, but the face would tell her what he was still deciding. I have a proposition. Rusk and I can settle this without federal involvement if he's willing to talk. Moreland looked at her with the expression of someone listening to a foreign language they understood partially. Mr. Rusk doesn't make propositions with women he's tried to murder. I understand. But that's a recent development in our relationship, and I think he might reconsider given what I've found. She lifted the grain sack slightly. Tell him I want to meet. Tell him I have the ledgers, and tell him I know about the Iron Mesa riders. Tell him I know about the gold, and tell him I know about a government shipment that never arrived. And then let him decide whether he wants to have this conversation or whether he'd rather I continue to the marshal's office. Moreland stared at her. He was running numbers she couldn't see, and she was running her own. How long before the Southwest riders cleared Ridgeback? Whether Carver could buy the time she needed. Where Harlan was right now? Whether the part of the plan she hadn't told Moreland was already in motion. Rusk will kill you, Moreland said. Not a threat, a practical assessment. He tried, she said. That's actually why I'd like to meet somewhere with witnesses. She looked at him steadily. I'm not stupid, Mr. Moreland. I'm not asking for a private conversation with a man who has already made his preferences clear. I'm asking you to relay a message so we can establish a meeting point with enough people present that both such sides behave. The Northwest riders had pulled up at a distance. She could feel them at the edge of her vision, but she kept her eyes on Moreland. He was the one who mattered right now. He was the one who would decide. I'll relay the message, he said finally. Thank you. She didn't lower the grain sack. Tell him tomorrow morning. The Ridgeback Stage Depot. Federal premises. Something crossed Moreland's face. Not agreement, something more complicated. The look of a man who was starting to add up numbers that weren't arranging themselves the way they should. Federal premises, he repeated. Federal premises, she confirmed. She was watching his face when he reached the part of the arithmetic where Carver's badge intersat with the location she'd specified, and the documents she was holding, and the question of what a territorial marshal's arrival would mean for the specific geography of whose hands held what evidence by what morning. He reached it. She could see the moment he did. He looked at her differently after that. "You already sent word," he said. She didn't answer, which was its own answer. Moreland sat his horse above her, in the shadow of the red rock outcropping, and looked at the grain sack, and looked at her face and made a calculation she couldn't fully see, but could feel in the shift of his body, the slight change in the set of his shoulders, the way his hand came away from his side, without having gone anywhere decisive. From somewhere behind her, and from somewhere behind her, from the direction Harlan had gone when they'd split, came the sound of a single gunshot. Not at her. Not at Moreland. She counted 2 seconds. Then she heard Harlan's voice from around the far side of the outcropping, carrying in the dry air the way voices carried out here. "Moreland, I've got your second rider." Moreland closed his eyes briefly, opened them. "Tell Rusk," Lenora said, "that tomorrow morning is his last opportunity to manage this quietly. After that, it's federal property and federal jurisdiction, and there's nothing left to manage." She turned and walked back toward her horse with the grain sack in her hand and her back to Dace Moreland, which was either the bravest or the most foolish thing she'd done in a week, crowded with candidates for both categories. He didn't shoot her. She hadn't been certain he wouldn't, and the 10 steps between herself and the horse were the longest 10 steps she'd taken since the canyon climb. But she made them, and she got her foot in the stirrup, and she got on the horse, and she rode around the south face of the outcropping, to find Harlan sitting calmly on his horse with a second rider, one of the Northwest group relieved of his firearm and looking unhappy about it. Harlan looked at her. Well, she looked back around the rock. Moreland hadn't moved. "We have until morning," she said. Harlan accepted this. "And if Rusk doesn't agree to terms?" She adjusted the grain sack strap. Her shoulder was a constant, specific complaint. Her hip had long since stopped being a surprise and had become simply a fact she carried. She looked at the road northeast and thought about Carver's rider, already most of a day ahead of them, riding toward the territorial capital with a message she'd asked to be sent. "If Rusk doesn't agree to terms," she said, "the marshal arrives before he can do anything about it, and we won't need his agreement. And if the marshal doesn't arrive in time..." She thought about the chamber. The water that had kept her alive when the canyon should have killed her. Her father's deed, folded in thirds, sitting now in Rusk's coat pocket. The 12 ingots still underground, still stamped with letters that made them a confession. "Then we move to the part of the plan where we're more creative," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "You don't have another part of the plan." "No," she admitted. "But I'll have one by morning." He made a sound that, from any other direction, might have been a laugh. They rode northeast into the afternoon, with the evidence in the grain sack and Moreland's second rider tied to Harlan's saddle horn and the southwest horizon behind them finally, blessedly clear of new arrivals. Somewhere back there, Carver was standing in a stage depot, doing the math of a man who'd bet on a line that federal authority still held meaning in this territory. Somewhere ahead, a rider was crossing ground toward a marshal's office with a message that was going to change the shape of what was possible. And in an underground chamber below a canyon that had been used as a disposal site for a woman someone had decided didn't matter, 12 gold ingots sat in a chest with a broken hasp, each one stamped with letters that had been accumulating interest since 1881. The canyon had tried to take her. Instead, she'd taken everything the canyon had to offer. And tomorrow, Bramwell Rusk was going to have to sit across from the woman he'd written off. And, for the first time in a very long time, he was going to be on the wrong end of a negotiation he hadn't arranged. Rusk came at dawn. Not alone, he never did anything alone, which Lenora had come to understand was not caution so much as theater. A man like Rusk needed witnesses to his power the same way a fire needed air. He rode in with 4 men at his back and Moreland at his right, and he took his time crossing the distance from the stage road to the depot yard, letting the sound of his arrival precede him the way he always let his presence precede him, arranged and deliberate. Lenora was already outside when he arrived. She'd been up since before first light, sitting on the depot's front step with the grain sack between her boots and a cup of Carver's terrible coffee going cold in her hands. She'd watched the sky shift from black to gray to the particular pale orange of an Arizona dawn that looked almost gentle until the sun actually cleared the horizon and reminded you it wasn't. She'd listened to Harlan moving around inside the depot, quiet and purposeful, doing the things that needed doing. She'd thought about what she was going to say. She'd also thought about the rider Carver had sent, how far he'd gotten by now, whether fast enough was fast enough. She stood up when Rusk's horse stopped 10 yards from the step. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, that settled, almost bored appraisal. The look of a man measuring something he'd already decided the value of. But something underneath it was different this morning. Not fear. Rusk wasn't afraid of her, but there was a quality of attention he hadn't had before, a kind you gave to something that had unexpectedly moved on its own. "Miss Whitcombe," he said. He didn't dismount, "Mr. Rusk." She didn't invite him to. "You look better than I expected." "I imagine I do." She held the grain sack up slightly. "You know what's in here. Moreland tells me you have some documents. Old records from a storage site on your father's property. That's one way to describe them." She lowered the grain sack. "I'd describe them as a complete record of every crime you've committed in this territory for the last decade. But I understand why you'd prefer the other framing." One of his men shifted in the saddle. Rusk didn't. "You're a long way from Copper Hollow, Miss Whitcombe. And a federal substation with one tired deputy isn't exactly a position of strength." "No," she agreed. "It's not. Which is why I sent word to the territorial marshal's office before I asked Moreland to relay my invitation." She watched his face. "Your man might have followed us out of Ridgeback last night, but he couldn't have caught my message going the other direction." The rider had a full night's head start. The silence that followed had texture to it. Rusk held it for a moment, held it the way a man holds something that's suddenly heavier than he expected, and then arranged his face back into its customary configuration. "Even if you sent word, a marshal won't arrive for 2 days. A lot can happen in 2 days. It can," she said, "which is why I want to resolve this today." He looked at her with that measuring quality. "What exactly do you think you're resolving?" "My father's deed. Returned to me, properly registered, with the boundary disputes dropped. The claims of the other ranchers, Rusk's men, drove off the Whitmore family. The Alderman estate compensated at fair market value." She kept her voice level, not aggressive, not pleading. The voice of someone reading from a prepared list. "And you leave Copper Hollow. Not incarcerated. I understand you have the resources to complicate any legal process for years, and I'm not interested in years. I want the land and I want the fraud stopped. You take whatever's left of your legitimate holdings and you go." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he laughed. It was a real laugh, not performed genuine surprise, expressing itself the only way it knew how. "You're offering me a settlement. I'm offering you an exit. You have some documents in a grain sack and one tired federal deputy, and you're offering me an exit." He shook his head slowly, still half smiling. "Miss Whitcombe, I've been operating in this territory for 11 years. I have the county records office, I have the sheriff, I have 3 members of the town council, and I have lawyers in the territorial capital who have made careers out of making cases like yours go away." He gestured at the depot. "This I have the Iron Mesa letters," she said. The smiles stopped. Not gradually. It stopped the way a lamp stops when you blow it out present, and then not, with nothing in between. The 4 men at his back couldn't see his face from their angle. She could see it clearly, and what she saw was not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it, the look of a man who has been confidently navigating a dark room and has just run his shin into furniture he didn't know was there. "What letters?" he said. His voice had lost its pleasant quality entirely. What was underneath was flatter and colder and more accurate. "The letters describing the arrangement between you and the Iron Mesa riders. The ambush. The 5 men killed, and the one who survived long enough to talk to a doctor, which the doctor was frightened enough to document and hide somewhere you apparently didn't know about." She watched his face carefully. "You knew the letters existed. You'd heard the writer talk before he died. But you thought the doctor had burned them." Rusk said nothing. "He didn't burn them," she said. "He hid them in the same place you hid your ledgers, which is a remarkable coincidence. Unless they're not actually in the same place by coincidence. And the doctor knew your records were there and chose to put his evidence in the same location as an insurance policy." She tilted her head. "Did you know he'd done that?" Still nothing. But the color of his face had shifted from its usual red-brown to something more uneven. "The doctor is still in Copper Hollow," she said. "I assume that's because you need him there, because he's the only physician in town, and because having him disappear would raise questions. And because as long as he's afraid of you, he's manageable. She paused. He's going to be significantly less afraid of you when a federal marshal arrives with those letters and asks him to verify the handwriting. You don't know what you're dealing with, Rusk said, quietly. I know exactly what I'm dealing with. That's the problem you're having right now. She took one step forward. You pushed me into a canyon and I found your records. You sent your tracker after me and he found me standing in my way with what I'd found. You rode here this morning to take it back and I'm still standing here. She kept her eyes on his. Mr. Rusk, you have had every opportunity to make me go away. I haven't gone away. I'd like you to consider what that suggests about how the next 2 days are going to go. He looked at her for a long time. Long enough that she became aware of the weight of the grain sack again, and of the morning light getting sharper, and of Moreland's horse shifting its weight behind Rusk's right shoulder. Then Rusk looked at Moreland. Something passed between them, not words, not a gesture anyone could have described exactly. Just a look. Moreland's hand moved toward his holster. The depot door opened behind her. Carver stepped out with a rifle across his arm, not aimed, just present, with the unhurried authority of a federal officer on federal premises doing something entirely within his jurisdiction. Morning, Mr. Rusk, he said, like they'd met before, which perhaps they had. Nice day for a conversation. Moreland's hand stopped. One of the 4 men at Rusk's back made a small adjustment in posture. That was all. Nobody completed any thought they'd started. Rusk looked at Carver. He looked at the rifle. He looked at Lenora, who had not moved. This isn't finished, he said. No, she agreed. It'll be finished when the marshal arrives. That's the offer I'm making you. Walk away from Copper Hollow before that happens, and I take what I can prove to federal court and leave the rest. Stay, and I take everything I have, and I let the marshal sort out what it means. You can't take my properties. You can't take what I've spent 11 years building. I can't, but the federal government can. She shifted the grain sack in her hand. The gold in that chamber is government property. 12 ingots, each stamped, each traceable to the shipment you rerouted in 1881. That's federal theft from a federal shipment. That's not a county matter. That doesn't go through the sheriff or the county records office or your lawyers in the capital. She held his gaze. That goes straight up, and it doesn't stop. The silence that followed was different from the earlier one, fuller. The kind of silence that exists after something has been said that can't be unsaid. Rusk turned his horse around. He rode back to the stage road without another word, his 4 men closing in behind him, and Moreland last, who paused briefly and looked back at Lenora with an expression she couldn't fully read, not respect, not defeat, something that's more complicated than either. The look of a professional who had encountered a problem he hadn't been adequately briefed to handle. Then he turned and followed. Carver lowered his rifle. He stood beside her, and they watched Rusk and his men diminish down the road. That went better than I expected, Carver said. It's not over, she said. No. He looked at her sideways. But you knew that when you said what you said. I needed him to make a choice, she said. Now I know which one he made. Carver looked at her. What choice did he make? She watched the road where Rusk had disappeared. She thought about the way he'd turned his horse, not the turn of a man accepting terms, but the turn of a man buying time. Reconsidering. Moving to a different position. He's going back to destroy evidence, she said. Whatever's left in Copper Hollow that connects him to any of this. He's going to spend the next 2 days making it disappear. Which means we need the marshal here before 2 days. Which means Carver's rider needs to have been faster than we're hoping. She turned and went back inside. And we need to get back to Copper Hollow before Rusk gets there and starts burning things. Harlan was at the table with a map she hadn't seen before, hand-drawn, detailed, the kind of map a man made of country he'd ridden for years. He looked up when she came in. He'd heard the conversation through the open window. The doctor, he said. The doctor, she agreed. If Rusk gets to him before we do, he's gone. Either gone or dead or so frightened, he'll say whatever Rusk tells him to say. She sat down across from the map, looked at the route between Ridgeback and Copper Hollow. 2 hours, maybe less if they pushed. Rusk had 4 men in Moreland. She and Harlan had 2 horses, and what was left of their respective physical resources, which had been spending down steadily since the canyon. Rusk will assume we're waiting here for the marshal, she said. He'll assume we won't risk going back to Copper Hollow, which is why we need to go back to Copper Hollow. Harlan looked at the map. If we're wrong about what he's doing, we're not wrong. He looked up at her. I know we're not wrong. I'm saying if we ride into Copper Hollow without the marshal and Rusk decides the risk of leaving witnesses is lower than the risk of federal exposure, then we have a different problem. She met his eyes. But if we stay here and he burns the evidence and silences the doctor, then the ledgers and the letters are the only thing we have. And most of its windows were dark, and he'll spend the next year challenging them in court while his lawyers argue chain of custody and origin, and whether a woman who was pushed into a canyon has a credible claim to documents she found in a location she can't legally enter. She paused. The doctor is the corroboration. Without him, we have documents. With him, we have a case. Harlan folded the map. We go back to Copper Hollow. She stood up. We go back to Copper Hollow. Carver gave them a third horse from the stable bay with a working trot and no particular personality, which was everything they needed, and they left Ridgeback as the sun cleared its morning position and started on the business of making the day hot. They pushed the horses harder than was comfortable. The terrain between Ridgeback and Copper Hollow was stage road for the first hour, and then open country, flat enough to move fast, and they covered the distance in a way that left the horses blowing and unhappy when they finally pulled up on the rise north of town. Copper Hollow looked the same as it always looked, which told her nothing useful. She'd expected it to look different, to somehow show on its surface the kind of interior rearrangement she knew was happening. But it was just a town on a bright morning. The main street quiet because it was still early, and the laundry and the hotel and the county offices all sitting in the same arrangement they'd always been in. Rusk's place first, Harlan said. If he's there, we know where he is. If he's not, he's somewhere else. The doctor's office is on the south end of Main Street, she said, between the assay office and the land registry. Which end do you want? She looked at the town. She thought about what Rusk would do, first what she'd do if she were him. If she had 2 days before a federal marshal arrived and an unknown quantity of evidence to neutralize, she'd go to the person who knew the most, the person who could say the most against her, who had the most to offer a federal investigation, and who was therefore the most dangerous to leave unmanaged. He'll go to the doctor, she said. That's the first thing. Then we go to the doctor first. They came into town from the south, which brought them in behind the row of buildings on the main street's east side. She left the horses at the back of the assay office, tied to a hitch post she hoped wouldn't be contested, and they went on foot. The doctor's office had a sign, Dr. Ambrose Cull, physician and surgeon, painted in faded letters on a board above the door. The door was closed. The window shade was pulled. She knocked. Silence. She knocked again, louder. Dr. Cull, I need to speak with you. It concerns the Iron Mesa riders, nothing. And then a sound. Careful movement inside. The kind of movement that tries to be nothing. Dr. Cull, she said again. My name is Lenora Whitcombe. My father was Elias Whitcombe. He owned the claim beside Deadman's maw. I found the letters you hid in the chamber. A pause. You wrote them so someone would find them eventually. Someone found them. The movement inside stopped. The bolt on the door drew back. Ambrose Cull was in his 60s, with the build of a man who had eaten regularly in his younger years and had recently stopped remembering to. His face was the face of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had stopped being able to hide the weight of it. He looked at her. He looked at Harlan. He looked at the street behind them. Inside, he said. They went inside. The office smelled like the particular compound of carbolic and old paper and something metallic that marked every medical space she'd ever been in. There was an examination table, a glass front cabinet with supplies, a desk drowning in folders. Cole moved to the window and adjusted the shade to let in a sliver of light without opening it further. You said the letters, he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the gap in the shade. We found them in the chamber, in the oilcloth bundle, beneath the crates. How did you find the chamber? My father left me the deed. Rusk tried to take it. He pushed me into the canyon, and I found the passage from the bottom. She set the grain sack on his desk. We took the letters, 2 of the ledgers, and 2 of the ingots. The rest is still there. Cole turned from the window. He looked at the grain sack like it was something that might move on its own. You went to federal authorities. Deputy Marshal Carver in Ridgeback. He sent word to the territorial marshal. They'll arrive in 2 days, possibly less. She looked at him steadily. Rusk was in Ridgeback this morning. He knows what we have. He's back in Copper Hollow now. Cole's face changed. Not dramatically, the changes in his face were never dramatic, she was beginning to see. They were the small, compressed changes of a man who had learned to keep everything internal. He'll come here. Yes. What do you want from me? She sat down across from his desk. Tell me what you wrote. Tell me what you know. Not because I need to know it before the marshal arrives, the letters say most of it, but because I need to understand what Rusk is going to do in the next 2 days, and you know him better than I do. Cole sat down slowly. He folded his hands on the desk, in the way of someone who needed something to do with them. I've known Bramwell Rusk for 9 years, he said. When I came to Copper Hollow, he seemed like a successful man with legitimate holdings. He was generous, initially, made contributions to the medical practice, helped me set up the office. He looked at his hands. It took about 2 years before I understood the contributions weren't generosity. They were investment. He needed a physician who would certify certain things. Cause of death, in some cases. Injury reports that told a different story than what happened. He was looking at the desk now, not at her. I complied in the beginning. Because I was afraid, and because I told myself the things I was doing were small enough that they didn't matter much. And then the Iron Mesa rider. He was quiet for a moment. He survived the ambush with a bullet in his chest and 2 broken ribs and a story he was desperate to tell someone before he died. They brought him to me. They thought he was unconscious. A pause. He wasn't, not entirely. He talked for almost 3 days. What did he tell you? Everything. Cole looked up. His eyes had something in them that had probably been clear once and had been clouded over it. Ever so gradually, he'd stopped tracking the change. The deal with Rusk, the route information, the meeting point. He told me his men walked in expecting to receive documents and rode into an ambush instead. He told me Rusk and the sheriff were both there, that he'd seen them, recognized Russ specifically because he'd met him before, during the original arrangement. He stopped. He was 19 years old. Nobody said anything for a moment. I wrote it down, Cole continued. I didn't tell myself it was bravery. I was a coward who needed somewhere to put what I knew so it didn't take up all the space inside my head. I put it in the chamber because Rusk had used the chamber himself for ledger storage, and I knew if it was found there, it would be found alongside his own evidence. I thought if someone found one, they'd find the other. He looked at her. I thought maybe Elias Whitcombe would find it. He'd been in the canyon, surveying. He knew about the passage. He said he hadn't gone through it yet, but I could tell he was going to. Did you tell my father what was in the chamber? I told him the chamber existed. I told him the land beside Deadman's maw was more important than it looked, and that he should not sell it under any circumstances and should make sure whoever inherited it knew the same. He paused. I didn't tell him what was in the chamber because I was afraid he'd do something about it immediately and get himself killed. I thought it was safer for him not to know the specifics. Lenora sat with this for a moment. Her father, being careful with the truth, someone had been half careful with him about. Layers of people trying to handle dangerous information safely and running out of time or courage, or both. Rusk had him surveilling the claim, she said. He knew my father was poking around. He probably suspected Elias had found the passage. He couldn't prove it. When Elias died before doing anything, I think Rusk decided the problem had resolved itself. Cole looked at the grain sack again. And then you arrived. And then I arrived. She stood up. Dr. Cull. When the federal marshal gets here, will you testify to what you know? He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she didn't push. She'd said what she needed to say, and now it was his decision to make, and making it for him was both pointless and disrespectful. He'll try to stop me, Cole said. If he knows you've been here, he'll try to stop you regardless, she said. That's already decided. The only thing that isn't decided is whether he succeeds. Cole looked at his hands. He looked at the cabinet with its medical supplies. He looked at the faded sign in reverse through the window glass. Then he looked at her. My testimony, he said slowly, is the only thing that puts Rusk personally at the ambush site. The ledgers show the money. The ingots show the gold. But I'm the only person still alive who can say that the man gave the order and watched it happen. He was organizing this out loud, and she let him. Without me, he has lawyers who will say the ledgers could have been fabricated. He has years of community standing. Yes, she said. He stopped. That's correct, she said. You're the necessary piece, which is why he's going to come here today, and he's going to try very hard to ensure you're not available to testify. She kept her voice factual, which means you can't stay here. Where would I go? Ridgeback, the federal substation. Carver will hold you as a protected witness, and you'll be there when the marshal arrives. She picked up the grain sack. We can get you out now, while Rusk is still figuring out what his next move is. Once he decides, we lose that window. Cole stood up. He looked around the office. All the years in it, the cases, the patients, the things he'd done, and the things he'd refused to do, and the things he'd done anyway, when refusing became too expensive. I'll need my medical bag, he said, and a coat. Make it quick, Harlan said from near the door. He'd been quiet for most of the conversation, which she'd noted and appreciated, letting her work the problem without adding a second voice that might make Cull feel managed. We don't know how much time we have. Cull went to the back room. She heard him moving. She stood in the front office and watched the street through the gap in the shade and thought about Rusk, who was somewhere in this town right now having his own version of this conversation, deciding, calculating, arranging the next move in the particular way of a man who had never had to improvise because he'd always been the one doing the arranging. He was improvising now. That made him unpredictable in ways she could only partially account for. Harlan stepped close to her. He was doing the same thing she was watching the street, reading its surfaces. 2 men at the far end, he said quietly. Standing outside the feed store. They were there when we came in. They haven't moved. She looked. 2 men, the casual stance of people waiting for something. She didn't recognize either of them from the encounter at the canyon. But that didn't mean much. Rusk's, she said. Probably. Cole came back with a black bag and his coat and the expression of a man who had made a decision he was going to have to keep making in small increments for the rest of the day. Ready, he said. Back door, she said. They went through the back room and out the rear of the building. The alley behind the south end of Main Street was empty at this hour, which was luck she didn't count on holding. She kept her hand on the grain sack and moved fast. The horses were where she'd left them. She got Cull onto the bay. He was a competent rider, as it turned out, which saved them several minutes of negotiation. They went east out of town on a route that stayed behind the buildings until it didn't, and then they were on open ground and moving. She looked back once. No pursuit. Not yet. They were 2 miles clear of Copper Hollow when Harlan said, quietly and without drama, behind us. She looked. 4 riders. Moving fast and organized, not the loose formation of men who'd happened to see them, but the tight group of men who'd been given a heading and a purpose. Moreland was in the lead, she could tell at this distance by the way he sat a horse, that particular upright economy of motion. How far to Ridgeback? She said. 1.5 hours at this pace. Less if we push. He looked at the horses. At Cull, who was keeping up but was not a young man. Some. Then some it is. She pressed her horse forward, and the grain sack bounced at her saddle, and her shoulder did what it always did, and she stopped paying attention to it because there were 4 riders behind her, and 1.5 hours of ground between where she was and where she needed to be, and Ambrose Cull on the horse beside her, holding his medical bag across his saddle like it was the thing he'd decided to hold on to through whatever came next. Moreland's group closed the distance by a 1/4 mile in the first 20 minutes. They were on better horses, or less tired ones, which amounted to the same problem. She ran the numbers as she rode, and the numbers were not encouraging. We're not going to make Ridgeback before they catch us, she said. Harlan had been running the same numbers. No, so we need to change the problem. She looked at the terrain ahead, flat ground, open in every direction, nothing to use. Then, further northeast, the edge of a canyon system she didn't recognize, not Deadman's Maw, something smaller, a tributary canyon that cut through the high desert at an angle she couldn't see clearly from here. Do you know those canyons? East Fork, series of narrow cuts. I've ridden through the first 2. Open or dead end. First cut goes through. Second goes through, but it's tight and the floor's unstable. He looked at her. It's not safe. Is it less safe for us or for them? He thought. We know it's unstable. They don't. She looked at Moreland's group. 3/4 mile and closing. Cull, she said. The doctor looked at her. Can you ride through a narrow canyon at speed? He thought about this with the unsentimental assessment of someone who had recently made a major decision and found the smaller decisions easier by comparison. If I have to. You have to, she said. She turned them toward the East Fork Canyon. The entrance was narrower than it looked from a distance. The canyon walls rose on both sides as they went in, close enough that she could have touched either one without fully extending her arm, and the floor was uneven rock and packed earth that made the horses shorter their stride instinctively. Ahead the cut curved to the left, and she couldn't see what was beyond it, which meant Moreland couldn't either. She heard Moreland's group hit the canyon entrance behind them, heard the change in their horses' hoofbeats as the sound bounced differently between stone walls. She pushed into the curve. The second cut was immediately beyond the first, a branching, the canyon forking with one passage continuing straight and the other angling sharply right. She took the right fork without slowing, which was either an informed decision or a committed guess depending on how it turned out, and heard Harlan follow her without hesitation, and then Cole's horse. The right fork opened into a wider space, not much wider, but enough, and then she saw the problem. 20 feet ahead, the floor of the canyon had dropped. Not a cliff, a slope, steep and loose, covered in shale that had slid from both walls and accumulated in a fan shape at the bottom of the drop. The horses could get down it, probably. Getting back up would be a different question. She stopped, looked back. The sound of Moreland's group was in the first cut. They'd taken the straight fork. She could hear the echo of hoofbeats against different geometry. They went straight, Harlan said. How long before they figure it out? 5 minutes, less. She looked at the slope, looked at the wide space below it, which opened into what appeared to be a longer canyon floor extending east. She thought about 5 minutes and what 5 minutes could be turned into. Down, she said. All three of us. Harlan went first, letting his horse pick its way down the shale slope with the calculated slowness of an animal that knew what it was doing, leaning back in the saddle, reins loose. Cole went next and managed it, though the base slipped twice, and Cole grabbed the saddle horn and stayed on by determination rather than skill. Lenora went last, and her horse was the most sure-footed of the three, which she chose to interpret as having earned that horse. At the bottom, the wider canyon floor ran east. She looked up the slope. No sign of Moreland yet. Ride, she said fast. They rode. The canyon floor was better than the slope, hard-packed, manageable, and they moved through it with the sustained urgency of people who had used up their margin and were running on the space after it. She heard Moreland's group find the right fork, heard the change in sound as they hit the slope and slowed, heard very distinctly the crash and scatter of a horse losing its footing on the shale, and one human voice saying something sharp and profane. She didn't look back. The canyon opened ahead of them into a broad, rocky plain, the East Fork spilling them out into open country that looked, at the far edge of what she could see, like a stage road, not ridgeback. Something else. She didn't know this road. She looked at Harlan. 15 miles south is a railroad depot, he said. Sagebrush Junction. Telegraph office. She looked at the grain sack, the letters, the ledgers, the ingots, all of it intact, after everything it had taken to keep it that way. Telegraph office, she said. We send word directly to the territorial marshal, not through a rider through the wire. We put the specifics in writing, and we get the name Bramwell Rusks on a federal communication that cannot be recalled. Harlan looked at her for a moment. There was something in his face she didn't have a name for, yet not admiration exactly. More like the expression of someone who has been watching a process they understand deeply and has seen it work the way it's supposed to work, and feels something about that. 15 miles, he said. Then we'd better start. Cole was already moving. They rode south with the canyon behind them, and Moreland's group sorting itself out somewhere in the echo of stone passages. They hadn't managed to navigate cleanly, and the morning continuing its business of becoming afternoon around them, hot and bright and indifferent. At Sagebrush Junction, the telegraph operator was a young man barely out of his teens who looked at the three of them travel-worn, horse-dirty, the doctor with his black bag, and the woman with her grain sack, and the rancher with rope, still coiled at his saddle from a use he hadn't explained with the wide-eyed assessment of someone who knew something. Significant was happening, but hadn't yet decided what. She put the message together on a scrap of paper. Tight, specific, the kind of language that left nothing open to interpretation, the documents, the location, the names, the timeline. She included the government assay marks on them, the ingots. She included the phrase federal theft of federal property 3 times because she'd learned that specific legal language, properly used, had a way of creating urgency that general language couldn't. She slid it across the counter. Send this to the Territorial Marshal's office. Send it now. And if anyone comes in here asking what messages have been sent today, you tell them it's federal business and you refer them to the deputy at Ridgeback. The operator looked at the message. Read it through. She watched his face as he processed the names, and she saw the moment Rusk's name connected to something he recognized. His expression settled into a careful blankness that told her he'd understood more than she'd explicitly written. Yes, ma'am, he said. He started sending. She sat on a bench outside the telegraph office with the grain sack in her lap, and Harlan beside her and Cull in the shade of the doorway. Most of its windows were dark, and she listened to the sound of the telegraph key working and thought about all the ground between this bench and where she'd started. The canyon floor, the damp earth under her palm, the passage in the dark, the water, the crates, the weight of the ledger in her hands and the name she'd read by lamplight. Her father's careful letters, worn soft at the folds. She didn't feel triumphant. That was the thing she noticed. She'd expected to feel something large and definitive, the way the end of a hard thing was supposed to feel. Instead, she felt tired in a specific and thoroughgoing way, and underneath the tiredness, something quieter, not peace exactly, but the particular stillness of someone who has done the thing they came to do and hasn't yet figured out what comes after. Harlan was looking at the horizon. He'd been looking at it since they sat down, the way he looked at terrain he was responsible for. Moreland will find us here, he said. Yes. She looked at the telegraph office window. The key was still working, but the message will be gone before he does. And after that, she thought about Carver in his depot, the marshal's rider already well toward the capital. The telegraph key sending its coded signal down a wire that ran northeast through territory, that was, for the moment tenuously, in the particular way of things, still being decided, still connected to the kind of authority that Rusks had not yet found a way to make go away. After that, she said, we wait, and we make it difficult for anyone to make us unavailable. Harlan looked at her. That expression again, the one she didn't have a name for yet. You're better at this than you should be, he said. I had a good teacher, she said. He looked at her with the slightly caught quality of someone who hadn't expected to be thanked for something. I didn't teach you anything. No, she agreed. But you believed I knew what I was doing before I was completely sure I did. That's worth something. He looked at the horizon again, said nothing, which was, she was learning, his way of saying quite a lot. The telegraph key went quiet. The operator came to the door. Message sent, he said. Confirmation received from the Capitol office. She exhaled, one specific controlled exhale. Somewhere in Copper Hollow, Bramwell Rusk was deciding what to do next. He was burning things, or burying things, or finding his lawyers, or doing the things that powerful men did when the architecture of their power started showing its construction. He had 2 days, possibly less. She had a grain sack full of evidence, a frightened doctor who had found his spine, a rancher who believed her, and a message traveling down a wire at a speed that made horses irrelevant. She stood up from the bench, adjusted the grain sack strap, felt her shoulder complain, and noted it and moved on. We need to go back to Ridgeback, she said. We need to be in front of the marshal when he arrives. Harlan stood, and if Moreland gets between us and Ridgeback, she picked up the grain sack, looked at the road north, thought about everything Dace Moreland had been and done. In this story, the lean man at the boundary of her father's land, the hands taking the deed, the figure on the rise, watching them ride away from Deadman's maw. Every time he'd appeared, she'd been in a worse position than she was now. Moreland's problem, she said, is that he's been working for the wrong man this whole time. He just hasn't understood yet what that's going to cost him. She looked at Harlan. Let's go explain it to him. They mounted. They rode north, the three of them, the woman with her grain sack, the rancher with his rope, the frightened doctor who had chosen something difficult and was still choosing it with every mile. The afternoon was at its full heat around them, uncompromising, indifferent to their plans, and the road to Ridgeback was open and visible and had nowhere to hide, which suited her fine. She was done hiding. Copper Hollow looked the same and nothing like itself. That was the thing Lenora noticed when they rode back in with Bellamy's party and Rusk. In custody, the buildings were identical, the street was the same width, the same dust, The same arrangement of facade she'd first seen from a stagecoach with a trunk and a deed, and the particular confidence of someone hadn't yet learned what kind of place this was. But most of its windows were dark. But the people on the street stood differently. They came out of doorways and stopped on the wooden sidewalks and watched the procession pass with the expression of people watching something they hadn't been sure they'd live to see. Nobody cheered. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was quieter than that, and more honest, the collective exhale of a town that had been holding its breath for years, without quite admitting it was doing so. She didn't look for particular faces. She watched the street and the road ahead and kept her horse at the pace Bellamy set, which was deliberate and unhurried, the pace of authority that doesn't need to announce itself. Rusk rode between two deputies with his hands secured and his back straight, arranged in the particular expression of a man who had not yet stopped performing dignity, because dignity was the last thing he had left to perform. He looked straight ahead, not at the street, not at the people, and specifically not at Lenora, which she noticed and filed away as the most meaningful thing he'd done in the last 4 hours. The first morning had taken her 10 seconds to understand what kind of man he was. Watching him ride through Copper Hollow in federal custody, she understood what kind of man he'd always been underneath the confidence and the money and the 11 years of arranged outcomes. He was a man who had never believed anyone he underestimated could actually matter. And that belief, more than the fraud, more than the corruption, more than any specific crime in those ledgers, was what had undone him. She had mattered, and she'd had to nearly die in a canyon to prove it, which was a fact she carried without bitterness, because bitterness required energy she'd already spent on more useful things. They put Rusk in a room in the sheriff's office, which had a lock and no occupant because Sheriff Castor was already in federal custody in Ridgeback. Bessamy spent 2 hours going through the office records with the systematic focus of a man reading a document he's been waiting for. She gave her formal testimony with Bellamy's note-taking deputy, speaking for 3 hours at a table in the same rooms where Castor had received her complaint about Rusk's men on her boundary line and had looked at it with that careful blankness. She told it all from the beginning. The deputy wrote without slowing. At the end he said, without looking up, "You've got a good memory." "I've had a lot of time to organize it," she said. Harlan gave his testimony separately, which took considerably less time, because Harlan was a man who said what was necessary and did not volunteer elaboration. Afterward, he came and stood outside the room where she was finishing her own statement, and waited, and the waiting itself said something she noted, but didn't address directly, because they were both tired in the specific way of people who have been moving on necessity for so long that stopping feels wrong. Cole spent 4 hours with Bellamy alone, which was the longest of the 3 sessions. Dark. She didn't know what was said in that room. She knew the shape of it, a man 9 years deep in something he'd helped build, giving the full account, paying whatever price that cost. When Cull came out, his face was the gray-white she'd seen in Harlan's back room, except this time it wasn't exhaustion. It was the look of a man who had put down something very heavy and wasn't sure yet what his hands were for. She brought him a cup of coffee. He took it without speaking. They sat outside the sheriff's office in the early evening air, which had gone from the day's full heat to something merely uncomfortable, and she said nothing, because there was nothing to say. That would be better than quiet. After a while he said, "Bellamy's going to recommend reduced charges in exchange for my testimony. I'll still face something. Probably lose the medical license." "Probably," she agreed. 9 years of practice. She looked at the street. At the ordinary life of a town resuming itself after a long interruption, a woman with a basket, 2 men in conversation outside the assay office, a child running without particular purpose along the wooden sidewalk. "What will you do?" He turned the cup in his hands. "I don't know. Something useful if I can find it." He looked at her sideways. "You're not going to tell me it will work out." "I don't know if it will," she said. "I know you did the thing that needed doing. That doesn't fix everything. But it's what was true, and you did it." He was quiet for a moment. "Your father would have liked you." She looked at the street. "He did," she said. "That's actually the part I'm most sure about." The proceedings took 3 weeks, not the full trial that happened later, in the territorial capital, and stretched across months with the particular slow machinery of federal justice that ground thoroughly if not quickly. But the initial phase of investigation, testimony, documentation, property seizure, an emergency appointment of temporary officials in Copper Hollow, took 3 weeks, which Lenora slept at Harlan's ranch and rode into town on most days and gave testimony on 7 separate occasions to federal investigators, a territorial prosecutor, and eventually a federal judge who arrived from the capital and set up court in the largest room of the Copper Hollow Hotel, which Mrs. Aldgate rented to the federal government at a rate that required no negotiation because she was engaged in her own process of demonstrating cooperation. Lenora was not a natural witness in the sense that sitting still at a table, answering questions from men who asked the same thing differently 3 times was not how she'd been built. But she was a thorough one. She answered precisely, corrected imprecision in questions when it mattered, and declined to embellish when embellishment would have made the account more dramatic but less accurate. The judge, a man named Forsyth, in his 60s, with the dry, particular humor of someone who had heard every version of human behavior and was no longer surprised by any of it, told her after her second testimony session that she was the clearest witness he'd worked with in a year. "I had 3 weeks to organize my account before I gave it," she said. "That helps," he said. "But most people organize their accounts in the direction of flattering themselves. You organized yours in the direction of accuracy." He looked at her over his glasses. "That's rarer." Rusk's lawyers arrived on the 4th day. 2 of them from the capital, expensive and efficient, and immediately busy. She watched them from across the hotel lobby the first day they appeared, and understood what the next months were going to look like: the challenge to chain of custody, the argument about the chamber's accessibility, the question of whether documents found by an unauthorized party on disputed land were admissible in federal proceedings. All the things she'd anticipated that night at the table in Ridgeback. The government ingots answered most of it. 2 ingots, stamped with federal marks, found in the possession of a private party after a documented federal theft in 1881. That case didn't require the chamber documents. It didn't require Cole's testimony. It stood alone, and it stood heavily, and Rusk's lawyers understood this because on the 6th day they began negotiating. Lenora was not party to the negotiations. She was a witness, not a prosecutor, and Bellamy was careful to keep those roles clean. But Bellamy briefed her after each session because she'd asked him to, and because she'd given him information he couldn't have gotten any other way. And he was a man who understood reciprocal usefulness. "He's offering a partial confession in exchange for reduced charges on the murder counts," Bellamy told her on the 8th day. "He wants to protect the ambush," she said. "The Iron Mesa killings are the worst thing in those ledgers. He'd rather plead the fraud and the theft." "Yes. And the offer is?" "He confesses to the land fraud, the cattle theft, the document tampering. The government gold gets returned, the 10 ingots in the chamber, plus the value of what he can demonstrate was sold. In exchange, the murder charges get reduced accessory after the fact." She looked at the wall for a moment. "What does Cole's testimony do to that offer?" "It puts him personally at the ambush site. Accessory becomes primary." Bellamy looked at her. "With Cole's testimony, the murder charges stand full. Then use Cole's testimony. It means a longer proceeding. Rusk's lawyers will challenge Cole's credibility, his own involvement, the 9 years between the events and the testimony, the fact that he cooperated in exchange for reduced charges." Bellamy was being honest with her, which she appreciated. "It's a stronger moral case. It's a harder legal case." She thought about the 19-year-old man who had ridden into a meeting expecting route information and found rifles. About the 3 days he'd spent in Cole's care, talking, knowing he was dying and wanting it on record. About the letter writer Cole, who had taken those 3 days seriously enough to write them down, even if it had taken him 9 years and a woman surviving a canyon fall to do anything with what he'd written. "Use the testimony," she said. "Take the harder case." Bellamy nodded slowly. "I thought you'd say that. I noticed you didn't argue against it." "No," he said. "I didn't." The property decisions took longer than the criminal proceedings and were, in some ways, harder. The claims that Rusk had acquired through fraud were straightforward in principle and complicated in practice. Proving the original fraud, tracing the chain of ownership, establishing what compensation was owed to families who had in some cases moved on and built lives elsewhere and were now being asked to come back and navigate federal land proceedings. The Whitmore family was found in New Mexico, farming rented land. They came back for the proceedings with the cautious hope of people who had been disappointed by official processes before and weren't ready to trust this one yet. Lenora met them outside the federal courtroom. The father was a quiet man with the weathered patience of someone who had rebuilt twice and was prepared to rebuild again. The mother looked at her with a directness that Lenora recognized the look of a woman who had learned to assess situations quickly, because slow assessment was a luxury that circumstances hadn't always afforded her. "You're the one who found the records," the mother said. "Yes. Why?" Lenora understood the question. Not the literal why, that was obvious. The other why, the one that asked what made a stranger put herself between powerful opposition and people she'd never met. "My father left me land beside that canyon," she said. "The same man took it from him as took it from you. It wasn't separate." She paused, "And because someone should have done it years ago, and nobody did, and I happened to be in the right place to do it." The woman looked at her for a moment longer. Then she said, "Thank you," in the tone of someone who doesn't say it easily, which made it mean more than the words themselves. The Alderman estate was more complicated because the man himself was still missing. His wife, Clara Alderman, was located in Tucson, working as a seamstress. She came back for the proceedings alone, because her 3 children were in school, and she didn't want to disrupt them yet. And she gave testimony about the night her husband disappeared with the precise, flat-voiced specificity of someone who has organized their grief into something manageable by making it factual. Bellamy's investigation didn't close the Alderman case during those 3 weeks. There wasn't enough evidence to charge Enipod's anyone, specifically Rusk's confession, didn't extend to what had happened to Clayton Alderman, and Moreland, who was cooperating in exchange for his own reduced charges, said he hadn't been involved in that particular event and couldn't name who had. Clara Alderman took possession of her family's land, which was restored to her, and she drove back to Tucson to get her children, and Lenora watched her leave and felt the weight of the thing that hadn't been resolved sitting alongside everything that had. That was the part nobody told you about justice. It resolved what it resolved, and it left the rest. And the rest was still real. You built if its windows were dark. You built what you'd managed to fix, and you carried the unresolved parts as carefully as you could, and you didn't pretend the carrying was the same as resolution. Her father's deed was recovered from Rusk's coat, which Bellamy's deputy had catalogued during the arrest processing with the thoroughness of federal procedure. It was returned to her on the 11th day, folded in thirds, with a small coffee stain on the upper corner she didn't remember being there before, but couldn't prove wasn't. Dispatch Dean. She stood in the middle of the federal courtroom and held it and didn't make a production of the moment, because the moment was between her and her father and didn't require an audience. The claim was restored formally on the 14th day. The boundary dispute was settled by reference to the original survey records, which Rusk had never destroyed because they predated his operation, and he'd needed them to establish the apparent legitimacy of his own adjacent claims. Lenora's northeastern boundary was confirmed exactly where the deed said it was. She rode out to the claim the afternoon of the 14th day, alone. Just herself and the horse and the flat, empty stretch of ground that ended at the canyon's edge. She stood at the rim and looked down into Deadman's Maw, which in the afternoon light had a different quality than it had. In the worst hours of her life there, not gentle. The canyon was never going to be gentle, but comprehensible. A place in the world with its own rules, and she'd learned them. She found the passage again from above, which she'd thought would be harder, but was easier than expected because she was looking for it now. She went down on the rope. Harlan had tied to a mesquite 3 days after the arrest, when she'd told him she was going back in to see the rest of the ingots retrieved properly, and he'd come with her without asking questions. Bellamy's people had taken the 10 remaining ingots and photographed the chamber for the federal record. The crates were gone. The ledgers she hadn't taken were in federal evidence storage. The oilcloth bundle's place on the stone ledge was marked with a small chalk notation from the evidence team. What was left was the chamber itself, the walls, the pool, the seep of water through the crack in the far walls, still going, indifferent to the legal proceedings it had made possible. She cupped water in her hands and drank, still cold, still clean, still tasting like the earth it had come through. She sat for a while in the underground quiet. She thought about her father, who had found this passage and known it mattered and not lived to see how much. She thought about the letter he'd written, "There's something to it if you know how to look," and whether he'd known specifically what she'd find or had just known that his land held something worth protecting. She decided it didn't matter. What he'd known and what he'd meant were less important than what he'd left her, which wasn't just the deed. It was the habit of looking when other people had decided there was nothing to see. She'd had that habit from him. It had saved her life. She went back up the rope and rode home. Home was still technically the ranch. She'd told herself, when she agreed to Harlan's offer, that it was a practical arrangement for the duration of the proceedings. She told herself this with decreasing conviction as the weeks passed, partly because practical arrangements that worked tended to persist beyond their original terms, and partly because she was honest with herself about the nature of what she was declining to call things. They worked well together. That was the most accurate way to say it, and also, in some ways, the most radical. She had expected to have to negotiate for the basic terms of her own competence with every person she encountered in Copper Hollow, because that had been the experience so far. Every man she dealt with had made an initial assessment of her that required overturning before anything useful could happen. With Harlan, there was no overturning required. He'd seen her walking out to the Badlands with dried blood on her face and an opinion about what needed to happen. And he'd gotten off his horse and crouched at a careful distance and waited for her to tell him. That was, she realized, over weeks, not a small thing. It was in fact a very large thing that she didn't have a name for except accurate, and accuracy in a person was rarer than it should have been. He fixed the barn completely in the third week. She helped with the last of the boards, which was either practical assistance or the continuation of something they'd started without formally agreeing to, depending on how you looked at it. He didn't comment on her helping. She didn't comment on his not commenting. They worked through then the afternoon, and he brought out water when she didn't ask for it, which was the kind of thing that became significant in retrospect. The spring, she said at one point, when they were sitting with their backs against the finished barn wall in the hour before the day cooled. What about it? It makes the land workable, the claim. I've been thinking about what's possible. She'd been thinking about this since the chamber organizing it slowly in the margins of the proceedings during testimony and waiting and the long rides back to the ranch. It's not farming country, not exactly. But the water changes the equation. Livestock can summer on that land if there's water access. And the passage sealed off properly, with the evidence removed, creates a natural cellar for storage. She looked at the middle distance. I can make something of it. Yes, he said. It wasn't an assessment. It was just agreement, simple and complete. I'll need to build, she said. A structure, access to the spring. It'll take time. Most things worth doing take time. She looked at him sideways. That's a thing people say, usually because it's true. She looked at the desert stretched out beyond the fence line of his property. Her property was 2 miles southwest, 2 neighboring properties. She thought about the arithmetic of that and what it implied and whether she was ready to say what it implied. And then she thought about the canyon floor and the darkness and the moment she'd put her palm to damp earth, and she decided she was tired of deciding she wasn't ready for things. Harlan, he looked at her. I'd like to stay, she said. Not temporarily. Not for the duration of the proceedings. She held his gaze. I'm telling you this directly because I don't have the patience for the other kind of approach, and because I think you'd rather know what I mean than have to interpret what I say. He was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet she'd learned to read, not hesitation, not doubt, but the internal consultation of a man being honest with himself before he spoke. Yes, he said. Yes to which part? Both, he said. All of it. He looked at the desert. I was going to say something myself. But you got there first, I usually do. The corner of his mouth moved. I've noticed that. She looked at the ranch, the finished barn, the house with its 2 rooms and its books, and the photograph on the windowsill that had accumulated the dust of a particular kind of grief. She thought about the woman in the photograph, younger, dark-haired, posed stiffly, the wife who'd died fast. The man who'd turned into a recluse afterward, working and surviving, and doing neither very joyfully. Your wife, she said carefully. I don't want you to feel that what we're meeting. She would have found you interesting, he said. Quiet, direct. The way he said things that meant a lot. She had no patience for people who couldn't say what they meant. A pause. She would have liked that you got there first. Lenora looked at the desert for a while. She didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say. That was better than that. The trial in the territorial capital lasted 4 months. She was there for the first 3 weeks and the last one, which middle months she spent on the claim which she had started building before the trial was complete, because waiting for everything to be settled before beginning was not in her nature. And also the spring wasn't going to wait. Structured dark. The structure went up slowly, which was the honest pace of a woman building with available help and limited funds and a shoulder that still gave her trouble in cold mornings. Harlan came on weekends and helped with the framing and the heavy lifting and the decisions that required 2 people looking at the same problem from opposite sides. He also brought food, which was not requested but was appreciated because she had a habit of forgetting to eat when she was absorbed in a task, which was a flaw she acknowledged and did not particularly plan to fix. She designed the cabin to sit above the spring, not directly above, but angled so the entrance faced east and the back wall caught the canyon's natural shade in the afternoon. It was not a pretty building. It was sturdy and specific, and built for the purpose of someone living and working in hard country, and it was hers in the way that things are yours, when you've put your own labor into them, rather than just your money. The spring was adapted carefully, with the help of a practical man from the county who knew water systems, and didn't ask too many questions about why a woman was developing this particular parcel. A pipe from the seep's natural outlet, a cistern, aligned to the cabin. Simple. Functional. The kind of thing that would work for decades if maintained. The first night she slept in the finished cabin, she lay on the cot she'd brought from Harlan's ranch and listened to the particular silence of a place that was hers, with its own quality of darkness, its own temperature, its own sound settling around her. She was aware that this was significant. She didn't make it into more than it was. It was at a place she'd built on land she'd almost died to keep, with water that had saved her life, in the middle of a territory that was still figuring out what it was. It was enough. It was more than enough. Rusk's verdict came on a Tuesday in what was by then November, 4 months after the arrest, almost exactly 5 months after Lenora had stepped off a stagecoach in Copper Hollow with a deed in her pocket and no clear plan beyond arriving. Guilty on federal property theft. Guilty on conspiracy to commit murder, the full charge, not accessory, because Cull's testimony had stood despite everything Rusk's lawyers had tried, and because the jury had apparently decided that a frightened man who had spent 9 years waiting for the right moment to tell the truth was more credible than the lawyers paid to discredit him. Guilty on 12 counts of land fraud, 11 counts of document tampering, 6 counts of bribery of public officials. Bellamy sent her a wire. 4 words, full verdict. Sentenced Thursday. She read it at the cabin and stood with it in her hand for a moment, and then set it on a table she'd built from lumber she'd cut herself, which was not level and never was going to be level, and went back to the fence she was building she's along the eastern boundary of the claim. Harlan arrived that evening. She'd sent him a wire, too. He came with his horse and a bottle of something that turned out to be better than the occasion required, and they sat outside the cabin in the last of the evening light, snip, snap, metch, with cups that didn't match each other's, and she told him the full verdict. He poured. They drank. He said, "Your father would be glad." She looked at the canyon rim, visible from where she sat the edge of Deadman's maw, the particular outline of the place that had tried to kill her and hadn't. He'd be relieved, she said. He'd say I took too many chances. Did you? She thought about it. The climb. The nights in the Badlands. The stand at the outcropping with moorland closing in. The things she'd said to Rusk in front of Bellamy that had been true and had been calculated and had been both at the same time, because there was no version of what she'd needed to do that didn't require all of herself without reservation. Probably, she said. But the alternative was to take none, and that would have meant staying in the canyon. He looked at her. You weren't going to stay in the canyon. No, she agreed. I wasn't. They sat while the light went from amber to the particular deep blue of desert evenings, which lasted about 15 minutes before going to dark. Stars came out in the way they did in flat country, comprehensively, with no competition from anything man-made. Castor got 6 years, she said. The sheriff, I heard? Hargrove got 4, conditional. She looked at the stars. Cull got 18 months suspended and probation. and the loss of his license as he expected. He'll find something. He told me he wants to go east, work in a hospital, something where his history is known and accounted for, not hidden. She paused. I think that's right. Starting clean somewhere that knows you started dirty is better than starting clean somewhere that doesn't. Harlan said nothing, but he was nodding slightly, which was his agreement. Moreland got 2 years, she said. His testimony was the reason it wasn't more. And the 4 men from Ridgeback? Rusk's men, charged as accessories. They scattered after the arrest. Bellamy's people are still looking for 2 of them. She turned her cup in her hands. The 2 they found got 18 months each. She stopped itemizing. It felt important to know all of it, to hold the whole account, not just the headline verdict, because the headline was Rusk, and the full story was everyone who had moved in the same system and either made it work or failed to stop it or chose silence, when silence was the easier thing. Justice in that sense was never as clean as a verdict. It was a long argument between what had been done and what could be proven, and it always left things that couldn't be resolved. She was making her peace with that. It was slow work. The Whitmores are coming back, she said, permanently. The father wrote to me last week. They're going to rebuild. She looked at the claim, at the cabin she'd built, at the eastern boundary where the fence was still unfinished. Clara Alderman is bringing her children back in the spring. She's going to work the land. Harlan was quiet for a moment. Copper Hollow will be different. It'll take time. She looked at the town's direction, which she couldn't see but knew. New officials, proper ones. The school that's going to be funded by the returned assets from Rusk's estate. The medical practice that needs a new physician. She paused. The people who stayed and kept their heads down, they're not bad people. They were afraid. When the fear goes, people mostly try to do the right thing. Mostly, Harlan said. Mostly, she agreed. That's what you work with. He looked at her sideways. The town council has been asking whether you'd be willing to serve on the land claims committee, the temporary one during the restructuring. She looked at him. You know about that. I heard it was being discussed. From whom? The new interim sheriff mentioned it to me. She looked at the stars. A land claims committee. The thing that was broken in Copper Hollow, at its root, was what happened to land who held it, how it changed hands, what protections existed for people who didn't have power and whose claims were easy to erase. She understood the mechanics of that better than almost anyone in the county, for reasons that had involved a great deal of personal cost. I'll think about it, she said. He said nothing, which was his way of saying he knew she'd already decided. She had. She just needed the night to sit with the decision before she said it out loud, because some decisions deserved more than a moment, even when the answer was obvious. Spring came late to that part of the Arizona Territory, which it usually did a reluctant shift in the quality of the air more than any dramatic change in the landscape. The desert getting a degree warmer and a degree less hostile, and the scrub finding color in the crevices where moisture had been accumulating all winter. The cabin was finished. The fence was done. She had 8 head of cattle grazing on the spring-watered grass that had come in on the eastern section of the claim, slow and green, and completely improbable given the land's reputation. Most of its windows were dark, and which she watched with a satisfaction that had nothing to do with triumph and everything to do with the specific pleasure of knowing you were right about something that other people had told you was worthless. The spring was good. It had always been good. It had just needed someone to find it. Harlan's property and her claim shared a fence line now deliberately, after a conversation that had taken about 10 minutes to reach its conclusion, because they were both people who said what they meant when they decided to say it. The conversation had been about practical matters, land boundaries and water access, and the logic of two neighboring operations sharing resources, and it had also been about other things, and they'd addressed both without pretending. One was the cover story for the other. They were married in April, in the practical way of people who don't have use for ceremony, but understand that some commitment witnesses 2 ranchers from the gates of the county, the interim sheriff, who had become a genuine friend, and Clara Alderman, who had come back with her children and was building her own life on her restored land, and who had looked at Lenora at the simple gathering afterward and said, "Your father did good work." Lenora had thought about this for a moment. "He left me good land." "No," Clara said. "I mean, he raised you right." She'd carried that sentence for a while. Still was on the morning in late spring when she stood at the rim of Deadman's Maw and looked down into the canyon that had tried to kill her and had instead given her everything. Not everything in the storybook sense. She wasn't confusing what had happened with a fable. The canyon had given her a legal claim to water, which had made the land workable, which had the spring the foundation of a livelihood. It had given her the evidence that had taken down a corrupt system, which had been necessary for the other ranchers and for the town, and for her own security on the land. It had given her the particular knowledge of what she was capable of, which was the most useful kind of knowledge a person could have. The rest, Harlan, the work, the committee she'd joined, and the cases she was already untangling with the systematic attention of someone who understood from experience what fraud looked like from the inside she'd built herself. It hadn't been given. It had been made the same way the fence was made, and the cistern was made, and the uneven table in the cabin was made, out of her own time and her own judgment, and the occasional help of people who didn't think help meant ownership. She heard Harlan's horse behind her. She'd heard him coming for a minute and hadn't turned because she'd been thinking, and she'd learned he didn't mind her thinking. He stopped his horse a few yards back and got down. Came and stood beside her at the rim. Below them, the canyon floor was shadowed and still. The passage was sealed, rock and mortar, their own work, done in January when the weather was manageable. The chamber was empty of everything except the pool and the seep and the dark. It was just a place now, just geography. The Whitmore father asked me yesterday if we'd be interested in a joint grazing arrangement this summer, Harlan said. That makes sense. His north pasture runs alongside our east section. She kept looking at the canyon. I'll talk to him next week. He stood beside her without talking, which was one of the things she'd found she valued about him, the willingness to be in a place without filling it with words. Some people couldn't do that. They were afraid of what silence implied. Harlan had been quiet for 3 years of grief before she arrived, and he'd learned that silence wasn't the same as absence, and that had made him good company in a way that noisier people sometimes weren't. You're thinking about your father, he said. She looked at him. How do you know? You get a particular stillness when you're thinking about it, different from when you're thinking about a problem. He looked at the canyon, more finished. Somehow, she considered this. He would have seen all of this and said, I made too much work for myself. He'd have been right. He would have also said the work was worth it. Would he? She thought about her father, genuinely thought, not the idealized version, but the real one. The man who had taught her surveying by making her do it twice when she got it wrong the first time, who had eaten from the same dinner 4 nights in a row without complaint because he'd made too much and didn't believe in wasting things, who had writ she'd worn the folds off of because they were the last of him she had. A man who had found something important and hidden it and waited for the right person to find it and had made sure the right person was the one he'd raised himself. Yes, she said, he would have. She looked at the canyon one more time. The depth of it, the shadow, the particular quality of a place that had once been the worst thing that had ever happened to her and was now just a feature of the land she owned, as ordinary as the fence line and as remarkable as the water. There was something she'd been trying to put into words since the beginning of all of this, since the canyon floor, since the damp earth under her palm, since she'd understood that the man who pushed her over the edge had done her an enormous accidental favor by putting her in the one place where the truth was stored. She'd been turning the thought over for months, the way you turn a stone and find what's underneath it, and she thought she had it now. The world had written her off before she arrived. Not just Rusk, the whole apparatus of how a place like this worked, had decided, before she walked off the stagecoach, what she was worth, how seriously to take her, how easily she could be removed. Too poor, too heavy, too female, too alone. The variables were different for different people, but the mechanism was the same. A decision made by with power that someone without it didn't count enough to worry about. And the answer to that, the only answer that actually worked wasn't to become the thing they'd expected. It wasn't to become lighter or richer or quieter or more agreeable. It was to be exactly what you were, so thoroughly and so stubbornly, and with such complete attention to what was actually true, that the decision they'd made about you stopped being the relevant fact. She had not become what Copper Hollow expected. She had arrived and fallen, and found water, and climbed out, and found Harlan, and read the ledgers, and carried the evidence, and testified, and built the cabin, and fenced the land, and let herself be loved by someone who saw her accurately from the beginning. She was the same woman who had stepped off the stagecoach, stronger from the work, more knowledgeable from the experience, but not changed in the ways that the world had tried to change her, not reduced, not corrected, not improved into something more acceptable. Her size was still her size. Her voice was still her voice. Her father's stubbornness was still in her face. Copper Hollow's opinion of those things was no longer the relevant fact. That was what she'd found in the canyon, underneath the ledgers and the gold and the evidence that had taken down an empire. Ah, not a secret, not a treasure in the storybook sense. Just herself confirmed the version of her that the canyon hadn't managed to break, standing in the dark with her palm on damp earth, deciding that damp earth was enough to start with. She turned from the rim. Harlan was watching her with the expression she'd finally found a name for. Sometime in the winter, not admiration, which was too distant, not love, which was too large without the specific weight that made it real. Regard. The specifics earned regard of someone who had watched a person be entirely themselves in difficult circumstances and had found it the most compelling thing they'd ever seen. Ready, he said. She looked back at the canyon once. The shadow, the depth, the place that had made her. Yes, she said. They rode back toward the ranch. Her ranch, his ranch, their ranch. The line between terms having dissolved sometime in January when it stopped mattering whose name went first. The morning was doing what Arizona mornings did in spring, which was to offer you a few hours of temperature that almost felt like mercy before the day remembered what it was supposed to be. The cattle were at the east section, moving slowly in the way of animals with access to water and grass and no immediate concerns. The cabin was visible on the rise, with its uneven walls and its eastern-facing door and the line of the fence running away from it toward the canyon boundary. It was not a perfect life. It was better than that. It was a specific life, with specific hard edges and specific satisfactions, built from the actual polarials available, rather than from what she'd imagined she might have if things had gone differently. Nothing about it was smooth. The shoulder just gave her trouble in cold weather. The Land Claims Committee met every week and was slow and exhausting, and sometimes she drove back from Copper Hollow so frustrated she talked to the horse the whole way, which was a habit she'd apparently picked up from Harlan. The fence needed work after the spring rains. The uneven table wobbled in a way she kept meaning to fix. She had built all of it. It was hers. Not because no one could take it, she'd learned better than to assume that, but because she understood now what it cost to hold a thing and what it meant to pay that cost willingly, and she was willing. The spring that had saved Dark, the spring that had saved her life, was underground beneath she rode across every morning, and it ran without stopping or needing to be acknowledged, and it would be there long after she was finished with all of this, the testimony and the proceedings and the fence and the committee and the marriage and the daily hard work of a life that asked everything and gave back exactly what you put in. Her father had left her the land. She had found the water. She had built the rest. The gold had only been the key. That was the thing she understood now, standing on the other side of everything, the key to the ledgers, and the ledgers to the truth, and the truth to the land, and the land to the spring, and the spring to the morning. She'd decided not to stay on the canyon floor. The real inheritance had never been in the chest. It had been in what she'd already carried when she stepped off the stage, the willingness to look at a difficult thing without looking away, to hold the full weight of what was true without flinching, to keep going when the going was the hardest version of itself. Her father had known she had it. He just needed her to find out for herself. She rode across her land in the spring morning and let it be enough, because it was, and because she'd learned the hard way that enough, when it's real, is the most valuable thing in the world.